This is the school named after John, one of the schools among thousands throughout the country, which, after the economic recovery, became the main one in the field of school education. The young heir to the Osborne Corporation, Norman Osborne, arrived at the school. It is rumored that Osborne entered the 11th grade without passing the martial arts entrance exam, although he takes it to enter the 7th grade. Suddenly, Norman heard a sharp cry, "Stop him!" And before he could react, a strange guy crashed into him. From the screams, Norman learned that the guy was a thief and decided to offer him help to pay for all his deeds. But in response, I heard only insults and envy of Osborne's rich life. As soon as Norman stood up, he immediately asked his guard to transfer $30,000 to the thief, because his father had many illegitimate children, and it was his duty to help them. 2 years have passed. Norman has lost all his money and his main place in the Osborne family, and is now trying to persuade the director to accept him into a special martial arts school. Suddenly the same thief came to Norman. Only this time he was dressed in an expensive peach-colored three-piece suit and walked with guards, as our hero had done before. As it turned out, that thief was Norman's brother Ron, who became the new heir to the Osborne Corporation, as he successfully passed all the martial arts exams. Ron literally threw a check for $15,000 at Norman's feet and began to chase his brother away like a dog, saying that they were now from different worlds. With a bright smile, Norman called out to his impudent brother and reminded him that 2 years ago he gave him $30,000. But if Ron didn't have the rest yet, then he could wait. Ron, enraged by Norman's words, threw a crumpled check for another $15,000 at his brother, but the hero calmly caught it and said goodbye to Ron with the same brightest smile. Norman sat and talked about his life, trying not to show that a storm was raging. Suddenly, the taxi driver distracted the hero from his thoughts with questions about Norman's life, as he noticed that he was leaving the Ian school. After a short dialogue in which Norman complained that he never became a pro at school, the taxi driver tried to cheer up the hero, because Norman knows at least something in martial arts. Their conversation was abruptly interrupted by a message about a criminal with a 2nd level of martial arts on the radio. Frightened by this news, Norman begins to talk about the structure of their world. After the economic downturn 50 years ago, the government began to support martial artists as they helped the country get out of the economic hole. Physical fitness is the lowest level in the field of body conditioning, which is divided into 9 levels, each of which can increase physical strength. Each body hardening increases the level, so practice and martial arts are complementary, although high-level skills are forbidden to be studied independently. The criminal who was mentioned in the news has a 2nd level of physical fitness, that he has mastered martial arts, unlike the main character. Suddenly, Norman's thoughts about the events were interrupted by the fact that the trip came to an end, and they arrived at the mansion that Norman had inherited from his mother. Approaching the entrance to the house, our hero again indulges in reasoning that without a talent for martial arts, his family abandoned him. Entering home, Norman saw someone's black boot tracks. Taking a knife from his pocket, the hero walked carefully in the footsteps of the alleged thief, slightly trembling with fear, because he had only recently heard the terrible news on the radio. But unexpectedly, it turned out that the one who entered the house was a young girl sleeping peacefully on Norman's sofa. The girl had a model appearance. A wasp waist, turning into a magnificent chest, echoed a very pretty little face and hair the color of wheat. Sharply pulling himself away from admiring the mysterious stranger, Norman went on to check the house, frantically clutching the knife in his hands. Suddenly, a thief appeared in front of the hero in the doorway, and there could be no mistakes. This is the same thief who was talked about in the news. Immediately, the thief began to threaten Norman, holding a knife in his hands, which felt larger than our hero's. After beating the main character, the thief took all the money given to Norman from his father, saying that with this money he can finally leave the city. Having tied the hero with a rope to a chair, the thief left, saying that if the checks were not valid, he would return and kill Ron. Bleeding after the beating, all battered, Norman reasoned that in this world without power, people like him could only be killed, and that the thief would return to finish what he started. But suddenly the main character received a notification starting the donation system. Norman, not understanding where the voice was coming from, frantically began to search with his head for the source. Suddenly, he heard an unknown voice again. The purpose of the system is the development and production of chi in the object. Still not understanding anything, Norman raised his head and began asking questions into the void. System. What's happening? You're in my head. The robotic voice confirmed its location. Norman's mind, then Norman asked where this system came from. Unfortunately, the system responded that this information was missing, and that the system was directly related to the spirit of excellence. As Norman found out, the system was in passive mode all the time and absorbed his energy all the time, preventing the hero from developing his skills, which Norman naturally was not happy about. The advantage of the system is that with the help of physical goods, the owner can develop his skills. Any material goods for developing skills can be suitable: coins, banknotes, credit card money, precious metals. Norman was very angry that the system did not start 2 years ago, since the prices are very high for his current position. But the main character decided not to give up because it is not too late to regain his place in this world, which was taken away by his father 2 years ago. The elder Osborne always disliked his son Norman due to his lack of talent in martial arts, while in the world they are very demanding. Everyone thought that Norman was an ordinary child who ate and expected to die. Because the hero understood that he did not have talent, he pretended that he was indifferent, deceiving himself with this. He tried his best to resist himself every day. He trained without rest in martial arts. But one day his guard told him terrible news that turned Norman's life upside down. Once and for all, his brother was able to reach the first level of mastery. As soon as his father found out about this, he was merciless towards Norman and threw him out of the family without flinching. But now Norman has this power, and now he can, despite the difficulties, get out of trouble. Suddenly, a sharp sound outside the door interrupted Norman's thoughts. The thief had returned. Norman, sharply taking his credit card in his hands, demanded that the system withdraw all the money and spend it all on developing his hand-to-hand combat skills to the maximum. The system counted the money from the credit card and reported that there was not enough money to develop the skill. Norman grabbed his head in a panic because he lacked just a little bit to level up. He frantically looked for where to get some more of the missing money, and having found some change, immediately converted everything for skill points. And this amount was not enough for him, and he continued to look for the missing amount. The system voice told Norman that he could convert other people's money, hinting at the girl still lying on the couch. Approaching the young lady, the hero carefully began searching for a wallet or the like in the girl's jacket. Having found it, he immediately began the lengthy process of converting the girl's money into skill points. At the same time, the thief had already entered the house with a bag of money and discovered that the hero was missing from the chair. Entering the living room, the thief shouted to Norman that hiding behind the sofa was not a good idea. He expressed his respect for the hero's courage and that he underestimated him. Norman began to play for time as much as possible in order to have time to convert the money into the development of hand-to-hand combat skills, and the conversion was about to end. Shouting wishes for death, the thief suddenly attacked the hero, transferring all his strength into his fist. But Norman was no slouch and quickly launched a counterattack on the enemy, hoping that his plan would succeed. And then their blows connected and formed a large shockwave that spread throughout the living room. As the system told Norman, the money conversion was completed right before the impact. The thief was surprised by the hidden powers of the protagonist, and he admires the fact that Norman did not immediately decide to show his real powers. After a short dialogue, the villain decided to attack Norman again with even greater force. Norman sharply dodged his opponent's blow, preventing him from hitting himself. But the thief slightly touched Norman's neck and a small wound appeared in this place, which began to bleed profusely. And again the thief, without reducing his ardor, began to swing for the next blow, and Norman, realizing that he would not be able to dodge again, began to make a decision. The solution was simple. With a sharp, strong head blow to the solar plexus, the hero tried to take his opponent out of the game. The villain only moved a couple of meters away, while Norman began to reproach him for his weakness. Angry, the thief began to gain strength for the next blow, preparing to take revenge on the hero for his words. The thief suddenly flew into the air, intending to strike the hero using the powerful hawk strike technique. Norman was also no slouch and also flew at the villain with a blow, trying to catch him making a mistake, but the blow was made into the void. Suddenly the thief found himself behind the main character, condemning him for being too slow. With a sharp blow to the back, the villain knocked down the unexpecting hero. The hero flew straight into the wall, knocking down the bags of money the thief had brought along the way. After his blow, the villain sharply grabbed his chest because the previously received injury was revealed. The hero simply lay there emotionless after the blow, and the villain began to rejoice that he was finished. Suddenly, Norman woke up from the blow as if nothing had happened, although he was battered from the strong blow. In an instant, all the cash that was lying around the hero was converted into skill points. The villain was unpleasantly surprised that Norman was not only alive, but the money that was around the hero suddenly disappeared. And Norman began to get up, grinning at the villain's fear. The main character began to prepare for a new blow as if he had not previously received a very strong blow from the villain. Taking a stance, Norman began to call the thief for the next blow, radiating complete self-confidence. Suddenly the girl, who had been sleeping on the sofa throughout the fight, woke up, and the first thing she did was look in the direction of the active actions. The villain suddenly flew at Norman with the intention of finishing off the main character, because he fell for the main character's beckoning. The girl, seeing all this, shouted to Norman to be careful. The hero himself began to prepare to strike the villain, taking the necessary stance, transferring all his strength into his fist. The villain just grins, because Norman is not going to defend himself, and boasts that the hero cannot compare with the speed of his technique. But then Norman dealt a sharp and precise blow to the villain's heart. The blow, with its force, seemed to pierce through the thief's body, and a bright luminous mark from the blow appeared on his back. The villain fell dead to the floor with a mark from the blow, and finally the battle was over with Norman's victory, and you can rest. The girl's name, as it turned out, was Nola, and she was very grateful to Norman for his action in saving her life. Norman in turn offered to return the help in the form of money, but if they don't have it, then they can come up with something later. Suddenly, Norman felt a sharp pain and weakness in his body and collapsed on the floor in front of Nola. As Nola ran up, Norman abruptly grabbed her by the shoulders and said that he knew how she could repay her. As it turned out, developing the body with the help of a donation system still eats up the strength from the body, as if a lot of training had been done without breaks. Norm had not eaten so much for a long time. He was pleased with the large amount of food that he had brought into himself. After a snack, Norm decided to check the body of the already killed thief, because who knows if he was still breathing, and at the same time asked Nola to call the cops. While Nola went to make the call, Norman began searching the body for any loot, just like in video games. Unfortunately, Norman found only a booklet on how to use the hawk strike technique. Norm decided to find out from the system why he was so hungry, because he was not warned about this. The system explained that when a hero's existing skills are sharply upgraded, the corresponding compensation in the form of strength and energy is taken away. Therefore, if pumping too quickly without replenishment, there is if not a 0 probability of death, and Norman will have to come up with something. After receiving all the new information, Norm began to wonder what he should do with the corpse. Suddenly another wall broke in front of the main character, interrupting his thoughts. It turns out that it was the armed police who came after Nola's call. Returning to the living room, Nola told Norman that she had already called the police and they should arrive soon. To her surprise, she saw Norm surrounded by security forces, and the hero himself sarcastically replied that he already understood. At the police office, the head of the police station approached the couple with an apology. He also added that the government highly appreciates Norm's help in capturing a dangerous criminal who killed many people. The head also said that for such actions there is a reward in the form of a medal for courage and $1,390 in cash. Norman decided to put pressure on Pity and began to ask for more money because he almost died, and if Norm had not stopped him, more people would have suffered. The head naturally doubted the hero's words. But Norman did not back down and pressed as much pity as possible, even taking the head's hands into his own. The head muttered that the hero was too mercantile, said that he would find out if it would be possible to increase the monetary reward. After a conversation with the hero, he switched to Nola and began to apologize for the poor work of the police and asked for help, but Nola refused. The head directly insisted on accepting their help, because he felt guilty for the events that happened to the girl. Nola, looking at the smiling Norm, decided to also ask for an increase in her monetary reward. The head, trying not to show it, was indignant in his head at the commercialism of our heroes, but still made concessions. After leaving the police station and receiving the reward, Norman found out why Nola was still pursuing him. As it turned out, Nola wanted to return the money that Norm took, and naturally Norman was outraged because he saved her. Suddenly, their dialogue was interrupted by a call from the protagonist's phone from Gal. Gal, Norman's former assistant, informed him that his brother would soon have a party and it would be advisable for Norman to come and kneel in front of his brother. Norman just grinned and reminded that Gal had not been working for him for a long time, and he did not have to help our hero, and then hung up the call. Nola decided to find out who it was that called, to which Norm replied that it was just his ex-friend. Then Norman abruptly offered Nola a job as his assistant because the girl really needed money. Nola immediately set boundaries that she would not do anything illegal, to which Norm replied that he just needed information about something and nothing more. The next day, Nola was already waiting for the hero at the meeting place, fearing that Norman had deceived her. But then Norman himself came and dispelled all the girl's fears, and also apologized for being late. Nola asked Norman where they should go, but after the answer that they had come, her eyes widened. It turns out that the luxurious mansion where they were standing belongs to Norman's family. Naturally, Norman couldn't help but boast that he was from a rich family, although Nola was skeptical about this. Without listening to the girl's sarcasm, Norm immediately went to the mansion grounds. At the same time, guests are gradually gathering at the Osborne mansion for the party of Harry, Norman's brother. 3 guests discuss the latest rumors while standing on the lawn and drinking expensive wine. Almost at the beginning, another guest arrived, a beautiful woman in a dress with a space pattern, with a gradient from blue to white. The greeter only snorted at the guest, because she walked by and didn't even pay attention to him. We return again to our heroes, who are standing behind a tree, discussing a plan of action. According to the plan, Nola was supposed to start distracting the guard at the entrance by coming up with any lie. Nola tried to put pressure on Pity, making puppy dog eyes, trying to distract the guard as much as possible. And fortunately for the heroes, Nola manages to attract the guard's attention as much as possible. While Nola was busy with the distraction, Norman carefully and quietly began to make his way into the party area. Once on the territory of the mansion, the hero began to indulge in memories of how he walked and lived here 2 years ago. And at this time, Henry was already appearing on stage, and the guests gradually turned their gaze to him. Approaching the microphone, Henry began to greet all the guests at the party, telling all the latest news from the Osborne family. That same woman named Rena turned out to be a member of another Parker family with whom they plan to collaborate. Suddenly, after the words about cooperation, all eyes were focused on Mrs. Rena. Her assistant approached her and began to calm her down and hint that she should answer Henry something. Suddenly, from behind her, someone sharply called out to Henry in a very familiar voice. Henry, frightened by the sharp cry of his voice, began to look at the guests with a frightened look. And finally, the gaze found a familiar figure, whose face was covered with a hood. Suddenly, Henry recognized the man in the hood, and along with Henry, Rena also recognized the guy. It was Norman, Henry's older brother and our main character. Norm started greeting Henry and saying that he really missed his brother. Suddenly, the guards started running towards Norman, intending to catch him and throw him out the door. Trying to escape from the guards, the hero jumped onto the common table. But things didn't go according to plan. Security began to surround the table in an attempt to catch Norman. Our hero began to try to run and jump on the tables, not allowing himself to be grabbed. Henry, tired of this circus, sharply yelled at everyone to stop the farce. At the same moment, Norman and the security stopped spoiling everyone's party and fixed their gaze on Henry. Norm, dusting himself off, stood up and thanked his brother, saying that he didn't doubt him. At that point, Norm started making puppy dog eyes and asking for money from his brother. Henry did not expect such impudence from Norman and was naturally indignant, saying that this farce was purely about money. But the hero did not give up, trying to put pressure on his brother with his conscience, because when he was the heir, he always gave money to Henry. Henry agreed to give money to our hero, and naturally Norman was very happy about this outcome of events. But a sly smile crossed his brother's face as if about to do some nasty thing. Suddenly, the expression on Henry's face changed from irritability to a soft but mean smile. To everyone's surprise, Henry jumped from the stage onto Nora's table, landing elegantly on the tablecloth. As the two brothers bonded over the table, Henry handed over a check for $70,000. As soon as Norman extended his hand to the check, at that moment Henry deliberately dropped the check at the hero's feet. Naturally, Norman didn't like this. He realized that his brother simply decided to humiliate him in front of the guests in this way. The main character began to make jokes in order to turn all the arrows on his brother, but this did not work very well. Norm realized that the plan to change the hands would not work, and saying that he was not proud, began to bend over to pick up the check. After the hero straightened up, Henry put his hand on his shoulder and began to wail that he hoped they would not be enemies. At the same moment, as soon as Henry finished speaking, he pressed Norm's hand so hard that the table underneath them broke. And he decided to just laugh it off that he wanted to make the massage simple because he saw Norman's weak body. The hero decided not to pay much attention to his brother's jokes and began to laugh it off in response. Putting the check in his pocket, Norman decided to quickly leave the party before things got worse. Henry himself, returning to the stage, ordered Norman to be released quietly and the tables replaced. In his thoughts, Henry laughed at the hero because he deliberately put pressure on his shoulder to weaken the hero. But he did not understand this. Coming out of the mansion, Norman began to be indignant in his thoughts at what a strong blow his brother had. But everything is already behind him and he doesn't need to worry because he got the money he needed for pumping. Suddenly, he was called out by Nola, who was already frozen in anticipation of the main character. As soon as Nola received her share of the money, she immediately began to admire Norman and apologize for her mistrust. Walking home, the girl again reminded the hero of his duty, and their way home was full of arguments about money. The next day at the Yan school, qualifying for elite martial arts classes was actively taking place. In the ring were teacher Ran himself and a middle school student who, apparently, had already begun to run out of steam. And so the student decided to strike again, hoping to hit the teacher, but Ran was too fast. The teacher, with a sharp movement of his leg, hit the student's stomach with such force that he sent him flying. The disciple was nailed to the wall and was about to give up his last breath, indicating that he would no longer be able to fight. Principal Yang and his deputy Ran sat on the judge's bench, looking at the teacher disapprovingly. It turns out that these are new rules, since previously the students had to fight each other. But after the situation with bribes, they abandoned this. At this time, the territory guard was sleeping peacefully until he heard a strange noise next to his booth. It turns out that it was Norman who was trying to sneak through the fence to get into the school. But he did not notice a branch under his foot, which crunched very loudly. The guard abruptly ran out of the beach, indignant at who was playing truant again. But next to the booth was the same girl from the party, Rena, who was just standing against the wall. Rena tried to distract the guard so that Norman would not be noticed and kicked out of the territory. After the maneuver, Norm thanked the girl for saving him from the guard and learned how he could return the favor. Rena only asked why Norman was trying to get into the school and, having learned that he wanted to go to the qualifying rounds, reminded the hero of the new rules. Having parted ways, Norman hoped that he would be able to return the favor to the girl, because this was not the first time she had helped him out. At this time, Ran found out who would be his next sparring partner and would try his luck to get into the elite class. Realizing that apparently there would be no one else, he began to accuse the new course of weakness and indecision. But his attention was attracted by a sharp cry, which said that he was next in line. It was Norman who walked through the classroom doors, preparing to duel with the teacher. At Ian's school, the hero's name was often mentioned because he was the worst student in history. The director wanted to kill the main character then, but unfortunately the rules did not allow it. Norman extended his hand upward, reminding him that he would like to try his luck in the ring and get into the elite class. The director, remembering how Norman paid bribes to get into school, was against the hero entering the ring. Ian almost started yelling at the main character to get lost and not even try to do anything again. The teacher, on the contrary, was serious about Norman because he had been waiting for this moment for a long time to kick the hero's ass. Having calmed down, the director decided to clarify why the hero came to school, because he had studied for a long time. Having learned that Norman was here to participate in the qualifiers, the director again began to drive away the main character with shouts. Norm calmly hinted to Ian that, according to school regulations, he had the right to try out for the qualifiers. Their dialogue was interrupted by teacher Ran, who stood up for Norman and said that he should participate. He began to say that he had heard about Norman's misdeeds a long time ago, and that he would not be able to fool everyone again. He wanted to make it clear to the hero that he is just trash who can only use his money. And the crowd of students, realizing what was about to happen, began to whisper, asking if the teacher would beat the hero to death. Because of Ran's words, Norm decided to propose a bet to confirm his intentions. After all, if a teacher looks down on rich kids, then they should bet money. If Norman passes, he will receive $1,500 from the teacher, and if he loses, he will transfer $15,000 to Ran's account. To confirm the seriousness of his intentions, the hero showed the teacher his credit card. The director naturally was dissatisfied with this situation, because betting is prohibited on school grounds. Ran, interrupting the director, said that he could not refuse a student if he offered a bet. After all, this is a matter of honor since he is a teacher and Norman is his student. Deputy Ran reminded Director Yang of Ran's character, and that he himself knew that Ran wouldn't give up easily. Ran only promised that he would not kill the hero, and that after that he was ready to accept any punishment. Norman, entering the ring, promised that he would be responsible for his actions. Among the crowd, Rena watched the teacher and the hero and recognized Norman's style, namely causing a big commotion. In the ring, two participants stood ready for battle, a former student of the school and our hero. Norman and the teacher of the elite classes ran. After the countdown, the referee lowered his hand, indicating the start of the fight between two people. The teacher, without hesitating for a second, immediately began to use the 1,000-flower Buddha technique. On the judge's bench, the deputy began to say that the Buddha flower technique was to create the illusion of multiple hands. Norman tried to read the teacher's movements, watching carefully with his eyes. And fortunately for the hero, he was able to block the blow delivered by Ran, saying that it was useless. Norm began to laugh at the teacher, escalating the situation in the ring, waiting for the next blow. Angered, Ran decided to strike next, putting all his strength into his fists. The judges again began to discuss the new technique because, unlike flowers, the monkey punch technique is designed for strength. At this time, the teacher was already flying at full speed with a blow at Norman, hoping to defeat him with one blow. The hero began to come up with a strategy to withstand the strong blow of the teacher. With a quick movement, Norman grabbed the teacher's hand, trying to interrupt the attack. With a sharp movement, the hero sent the teacher to the floor, parrying the blow. Everyone was surprised by this outcome of events. Even the judges stirred in amazement. Norman, almost exhausted, shook himself off and lamented to Ran that he had underestimated him. That in addition to joining the elite class, he is here to prove that all members of the Osborne family are honest and strong people. At the end of his remarks, Norman demanded that the most powerful technique be used against him. Ran responded by asking forgiveness for his prejudices and agreeing to use his strongest move. Director Yang was more outraged than ever by this turn of events, since Ran could have killed the student. But at the same moment, the director was interrupted by Deputy Ran, reminding him that they were paying the entire salary to the teacher's wife. While the judges were talking, Ran had already jumped on Norman with another kick. Suddenly, the hero managed to escape from under the teacher, which surprised everyone. Finding himself behind the teacher, Norm said that Teacher Ran pretty much scared him, but thank God he managed to react quickly. Ran was outraged by this outcome of events, as he hoped that Norm would take the blow. The hero went to check with the judge whether he passed the qualifying rounds since he withstood 3 blows. The teacher began to directly attack Norman because he said that he would not shy away. What followed was nothing but insults and demands to take another blow. Norman agreed, but on the condition that the winning amount rises from $1,500 to $15,000. Suddenly, Director Yang intervened between them, saying that, according to the rules, the hero goes to the elite class, since he withstood 3 blows from the teacher. But because Norman and Teacher Ran broke the rules, the fine will be deducted from the winnings, which Norm began to resent. To which Yang reminded the hero that it was better for him to give in, since Ran would be his teacher. After talking with the director, the teacher approached Norm and asked him to tell him the account, where to send him the money. When leaving, he only said that he would take care of the main character after the start of the school year. The next day at the Jan school, walking into a new classroom, Norman almost fell into a trap with a bucket of water set by the students. Walking through the class, the hero heard condemnation from everyone in his back, saying that he had unfairly defeated the teacher. Having tried to sit at his desk, he saw that there was no seat on the chair. Apparently, his classmates also tried to fix this. As a result, he sat down with his old friend Rena, who was the only one who did not judge him. Rena told the hero not to worry and that she was also an outcast in the class. As class began, they shook hands to celebrate Norman's acceptance into the elite class. At the end of the day, the main character fell exhausted on his sofa, saying how tired he was. At school, the teacher put in a lot of homework because the hero missed a lot and now has to catch up with the program. Norman, like a true diligent student, promised that he would do all his homework, grabbing a mountain of textbooks in his hands. But at home, as Norm began unpacking his textbooks from his briefcase, he wondered how he could cope with all this. He was distracted by an unexpected knock on the door, and naturally the hero went to find out who could come at such a late hour. Suddenly, his recent acquaintance Nola ran into the hero's house and asked him for refuge. The hero tried to find out who she was running from, but the girl had already hidden behind the wall and asked not to talk about her. Suddenly, a crowd of men appeared on the threshold of the house, looking like bandits in appearance, and they asked where the girl had run. Norman, using all his acting skills, began to be indignant, saying how dare they bother him at such a late hour. The men began to whisper that they had come and bothered the hero in vain. Norman only continued his presentation with phrases that he had not seen anyone, and that before he cared about poor people. The men apologized to the main character and said that they would leave now. As they were leaving, the bandits discussed that they needed to break through Norm and find out who he was and what he was doing, since they saw Nola run into the hero's home. Meanwhile, Norman calmly closed the door, glad that the performance ended successfully. Turning his head towards Nola, he asked with a serious look what those men wanted from the girl. As it turns out, Nola's father often gambled in casinos and spent money to no avail. This time, he owed the casino owners a large sum and decided to run away from the city, and the bouncers came to Nola's home. Since the girl is the daughter of the debtor, they decided to start demanding money from her. After the story, Nola began to thank Norman and said that she would soon leave him. The hero did not agree with this and said that the girl should stay at his home, as it would be safer. Nola was glad to hear this and looked at the hero with loving eyes. But she had to see the insolent look of Norman, who came up with an activity for her. Nola was afraid that the hero would need her body, so she immediately began to try to somehow refuse. But Norm's plan was that he would dump all his homework on the girl and thus kill 2 birds with 1 stone. In the morning at the Osborne mansion, Henry reasoned with his assistant that his brother Norman had entered the elite class by some miracle. Henry assumed that the money he gave Norman was used to bribe the director. Already at school, 3 bullies from the elite class were discussing how to frame Norman so that Henry would notice them. Each of them was overly confident in their own strength and that Norman did not deserve the Osborne name. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by Norman himself, who had been eavesdropping on their conversation all the time. He invited them to solve all the issues at once here, at the place where they crossed paths. The bullies agreed with his proposal, warning him that he would not hold back, since there were no cameras here. Norm was only glad that there were no cameras and got into a fighting stance, preparing for a fight. After a short time, the bullies all lay before the hero's feet, all beaten, surprised by Norman's strength. The main character asked them not to pester him anymore, putting his foot to the head of the main one. As soon as Norman heard a positive answer, he demanded that all the money be given to him as an apology. The bullies, without resisting, gave him all their pocket money, asking him not to touch it anymore. The hero, having taken the money, happily began to leave, saying goodbye to the guys. But their classmates decided to tell the director that Norman had beaten them just like that. Having run to Director Jan, they immediately began to complain that the hero had beaten them just like that. But they didn't notice that Norm had already gotten ahead of them and turned on the bully dialogue to the director. The boys, realizing that they were at a dead end, tried to somehow justify themselves to the school principal. Already in the classroom, the bullies looked after Norman like servants, since the director said that until they were forgiven, they would not be allowed to attend classes. Suddenly, Norman's entire idyll was interrupted by the senior Kane, who apologized for the entire class. The hero naturally asked his temporary servant who this guy was, and they explained to him that this was one of the best students in the class, Kane. Exhaling heavily, Norman accepted Kane's apology. In response, the eldest asked to forgive the other three, and to stop mocking them since they already understood how wrong they were. Not though, the hero agreed to let the bullies go and directly quoted that he forgives them. During a lesson on a fresh holiday, the hero discussed what else he needed to do to achieve his goals. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by his younger brother Nick, offering to meet in the ring, since he was not at all confident in the hero's powers. Nick all the time, as Norman remembered him, hovered around the hero, trying to please him with everything he could. Norm just said that it wouldn't be an interesting fight, and he knew Nick would be interested. At the same moment, the hero called the elder Kane to come to them. As soon as Kane approached them, Norman immediately said that Nick wanted to learn about the features of the elder's technique. As soon as Kane began to explain, Nick immediately noticed that Norman had managed to escape unnoticed. The main character himself went to the teacher to ask for time off from classes to improve his health. The teacher agreed to give him a day off, but on the condition that the hero do a pile of homework. Arriving home, Norman saw how Nola had fallen asleep at work, since she had been working all night. Night fell and Nola began to wake up little by little. She noticed that she was wearing Norman's jacket, and was surprised that he had already arrived. Going out into the yard, she saw him working out, judging him in her head for his bad movements. Norman saw that his girlfriend had already woken up and was looking at him disapprovingly, and decided to find out why. Nola was afraid that he would kick her out, so she tried to explain that his movements were wrong, trying to smooth out the corners. After some time, Nola joined Norman, helping him make the right movements. Morning came and the main character trained and trained while Nola complained about him. Throwing her a wad of money, he asked her to explain in more detail how to do the hawk strike. Nola immediately agreed, and her drowsiness disappeared, as if by hand, which Norm was not surprised at all. Step by step, Norman tried to do the necessary exercises to unlock the hawk strike technique. Nola helped him with this. Although her movements were poor, she explained it very clearly in words. And after a lot of time, the system finally notified him that the new skill was unlocked. Norm had specially prepared a special ki capsule for this purpose to increase the amount of chi energy so as not to die. After he swallowed the capsule, the hero demanded that the system raise the level of the hawk strike technique to medium level. Then he demanded to continue raising the equipment to an elevated level. After completing the promotion process, Norman noticed that the effect of the pill had worn off, and he was very tired. Suddenly, Nola came running to him, inviting him to dinner, and Norman accepted the invitation with great pleasure. The next day, a martial arts tournament was held among students at the Yang School. The evaluation system was such that in order to raise your place, you had to defeat opponents higher in the table and take their places. The judge informed the students that Kane, who was in first place, and Rena, who was in second place, were absent from the competition, so everyone's rating was raised by 1. Nick was glad of this circumstance since now he is in first place among everyone. Norman was given the lowest rank since he participated in the competition for the first time. The hero only told the judge not to worry and that he would give his best. Behind Norman's back, other students were skeptical of the hero's words and reminded each other not to accept money from him. After 15 minutes, Nick arrogantly learned why no one wanted to invite him to the fight. Continuing his monologue, Nick called everyone trash if you were afraid to deal with it. Then it turned out that our hero was already waiting for Nick at the other end of the ring, challenging him to a duel. Suddenly, all the students turned their gaze to the ring as everyone was sure that Norman was simply suicidal. Nick, on the other hand, accepted his older brother's challenge with an arrogant smile, hoping to teach him a lesson. Norman and Nick got into fighting stances in preparation for the fight. Norman himself reminded his little brother that he had always been a suck-up. As soon as the fight began, Norm immediately attacked Nick with a blow. In response, Nick tried to hit the hero faster, but to his surprise, missed. Norman suddenly appeared behind his brother and hit him on the back using the hawk strike technique. As a result of the fight, Norman ended up in first place and Nick in last. No one expected such an outcome because everyone thought that our hero was weak. But suddenly everyone noticed how Norman seemed to have deliberately lost to the fat one so that he would end up in first place. The crowd didn't understand what was going on here at all, but one student decided to take the chance and take first place. He easily beat the chubby guy and took first place, rejoicing at his easy victory. But like a nightmare, Norman appeared behind him and offered to talk, that is, inviting him to a duel. A classmate, frightened by Norman, did not even begin to fight with him, and immediately gave up his first place. And again, to the surprise of everyone, Norm again gave first place to the obese. While the chubby guy was rejoicing in first place again, Norm was doing some strange calculations behind his back. At the same time, Nick fights with each participant, gradually raising his rank. He continued to humiliate his classmates because they were weaker than him and could not cope with him. Norman quietly began offering his services to those who had lost their tournament rank because of Nick. Sitting in 10th place, Nick was preparing to go into battle with 3rd place in the tournament. Suddenly, Norman appeared behind him, offering to talk on the sidelines, thereby frightening Nick. As it turned out, Norman came up with a way to earn money based on the return of the tournament rank. At the end of the tournament, everyone went to the winner's board to find out who was in what place. The 1st place was taken by the chubby one, and the last 2 were unexpectedly taken by Norman and Nick. Nick was hysterical, as he had worked his way up to 3rd place in the rankings. Norman himself was happy with everything, since he earned a decent amount of money from his scheme. Teacher Ran, who returned after being suspended, decided to find out who took 1st place. It turned out that they were taken by some of the weakest students. The teacher was furious, as he did not tolerate such an impudent attitude towards the tournament. Hearing Ran yell at him, Norman turned to find out what happened. Ran began to attack the hero that he violated the rules of the tournament and helped others climb the rankings for money. Norman tried to justify himself because this was the only way he was trying to get along with his classmates and raise morale. Ran, gritting his teeth, threatened the hero that this was his last such prank, and he would not allow the situation to repeat itself. 2 days later, a plump guy approached Norman and began to thank the main character, because he was able to invite a beautiful girl due to his rating. As gratitude, the hero was given a pill to restore chi energy. Already in class, Norman was thinking about new ways to earn money, because he did not want to anger teacher Run anymore. Suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of the elder Kane, who strongly condemned the hero for his action. Norman tried to stand up for himself, saying that it was none of Kane's business and that he should stay out of it. The elder decided to call our hero to fight in order to teach him how not to act. Reluctant to fight, Norman began to apologize to Kane and say that this would not happen again. But the elder was determined to show the hero a lesson, so he offered to bet on money. Of course, our hero, due to his greed, could not resist the challenge and agreed to the bet. Rena, sitting under the shade of a tree outside the school, felt that something was wrong. Already in the ring, the opponents greeted each other. Immediately after the start of the fight, Norman rushed at Kane with a strong blow, hoping to win without wasting much strength. But Kane, to the surprise of our hero, was able to block the blow without shaking too much. As it turned out, the elder used the reflection barrier technique, which blocked any enemy strike. Norman, realizing what he had gotten himself into, tried to come up with options on how to defeat Kane as quickly as possible. Suddenly, Rena came to the arena, trying to find out what happened, which is why all the fuss was going on. Kane was immediately distracted from the fight and asked Rena to leave because he was secretly in love with her. Norman quickly realized this and decided to act immediately while Kane was distracted. Shouting that he would strike, he immediately nailed the elder to the floor using the hawk strike technique. Rejoicing in his victory, Norman turned away from his opponent and struck a stylish pose. Naturally, the public did not like Norman's dirty tricks and showered him with cries of condemnation. Rena understood that if she had not come now, Kane would not have lost. At this time, at the extortionist base, the leader found information about Norman. After discussing with their employee, they came to the conclusion that this should be reported to their main boss. At the other end of the city, Herman, the head of all extortionists, interrupted his lunch, giving him information about our main character. Previously, chaos reigned in the city's underground market, not to mention violent methods of debt collection, but a black cloak appeared and took control of everything. And now Herman called the Black Cloak to find out what to do with Norman. The cloak allowed him to attack Norman, but he would deal with his family himself, and they would not be a hindrance. Herman was glad to hear this, because it meant the opportunity to get rich big. Cloak in his office was glad that he had a large number of subordinates and could not get his hands dirty. At the same time at school, Kane, approaching Norman, said that the winnings would soon be credited to his account. Our hero decided to find out why the elder, although rich, did not give money in cash. In response, he began to receive a lot of moralizing, which is why he asked me to stop talking. He realized that Kane was strictly taught how to spend money correctly, and, surprisingly, he followed it just as strictly. The elder offered to go to class together, but Norman refused, since he had already asked to go home. In the classroom itself, Teacher Rand was so furious that he even broke the chalk on the blackboard. After all, Norman did not show up for class, which added even more gasoline to the hatred towards him. In parallel with all the events, Nola returned home, allegedly greeting Norman. But in fact, Rena came to the hero's house to discuss a couple of matters and find out how things were going. Before the girls had time to meet each other, they heard the door to the house being broken down. These were people sent by Herman to lure money out of Norman. Rena, as a student of an elite martial arts class, was the first to attack the bandits, knocking out one at first with one blow. And then with a second blow, she instantly knocked out the second one. Suddenly, the leader of this trio came at her, saying that he should not have underestimated her. But adding that she could not cope with him, he attacked her with eyes full of rage. While the fight was taking place at his home, while waiting for funds to arrive, Norman played on the arcade machines. As it turned out, Kane also went with him and continued to lecture him, saying that this was impossible, that he had to go to lessons. They were interrupted by a sharp call from the home phone to Norman, who thought it was Nola, who had already arrived home, calling. But this was the same leader who reported that he had captured his 2 girlfriends, and that a ransom was awaiting them. The villain warned that if the hero did not come soon with the required amount, then his girlfriends would die. Norman tried to pretend that he didn't know them and had no idea who he was talking about. After showing off his acting skills, Norman hung up, much to the surprise of the bandit leader. Naturally, the main character was not going to sit idly by and quickly walk towards his house. Suddenly, the bandits called him again from his house, as they realized our hero's pretense. They said that they were not bluffing and could kill the girls, and that Norman had better hurry up. Norman tried again to pretend that he didn't understand what the kidnappers were talking about, but in the end they hung up faster than our hero could answer them. Kane, who had followed Norman, began to find out who it was, and, having learned what had happened, said that he would help our hero. Having already arrived at the house, the bandits noticed a man in the protagonist's cap and sweatshirt. The first bandit rushed at the guy, shouting that he had finally been caught, but suddenly he was pushed away from the guy as if by a spring. It turned out that it was Kane in disguise, who distracted the bandits in the yard, giving Norman a chance to get inside. Inside the house, Norman, with a quick blow, immediately took out 2 bandits who were standing near the tied-up girls. After checking that there was no one else, our hero decided to untie his friends, wondering how they could get into such trouble. But suddenly Norman was called out by the leader coming around the corner saying that he had expected such a maneuver. The leader was not surprised that Norman came to help in this way and invited him to a duel. Having offered Norman the last words, he heard only a message to hell and naturally got angry and began to prepare for the first blow. But then Kane hit him in the back, knocking the bandit down. Then Norman struck, finishing off the criminal so that he left the game before the fight. The guys rejoiced at their easy victory and congratulated each other on their good shots. As Kane left, he began to feel that something was wrong, as if they had forgotten something, and his instincts did not deceive him. The elder received a sharp and quick blow in the back with such force that it knocked out his breath. He was a half-baked bandit who, as it turned out, was not so easy to take out of the game. Norman began to come up with a plan on what to do, while at the same time ordering his girlfriends to leave the house and go further away. The guys decided to share responsibilities. Norman would take the girls out and call for help, and Kane would detain the villain. Very angry, the elder used the barrier technique to the maximum, giving his friends time to leave. But the bandit easily breaks through the elder's defense, hitting him in the stomach. And so Kane fell again, the criminal thinking that everything was over with him when after the escaped trio. But it's not that simple. Kane didn't want to just give up and grabbed his opponent's leg in an attempt to slow him down. Out of anger, the villain kicked the older man in the head with all his might, trying to finish him off. Despite the fact that Kane was already bleeding all over, he still tried to somehow apprehend the criminal. The bandit wanted to finish off the elder when he heard someone enter the house. It was Norman who thanked Kane for his efforts and that he could rest easy now. Afterwards, he himself challenged the bandit to a fight because he was the reinforcement that he called. The criminal only laughed at the main character because he knew that he became famous for his inability to develop in martial arts. Norman was angry at the hypocrisy and at the fact that the bandit had maimed his friend and threatened his girlfriends. From childhood, the main character was prepared to become the heir to the Osborne Corporation. His father taught him that no matter the situation, he, as an heir, must be able to calculate everything before acting. This advice helped him even when he was kicked out of his family so as not to get divorced. Accurate calculation can bring maximum benefits in life. And even now, Norman began to calculate the path to victory, since the bandit was clearly sent to kill the main character. Norman thought that sometimes it is better to do something, even if the probability of success is close to 0, than to run away and regret it for the rest of his life. The main character easily dodged the enemy's blows, since due to his rage, the accuracy of the villain's blows decreased. Norman quickly calculated his every move, and the villain was surprised at how fast the main character was. Suddenly, our hero jumped from the balcony to the next window, trying to land carefully. But this time the villain was faster and struck straight in the air, knocking the hero off course. Norman was thrown onto a bookcase in the library, scattering all the books around him. Suddenly the main character received a notification about the receipt of funds, and he realized that this was his chance. Norman took the key restoration pill, which made the villain surprised and asked questions of misunderstanding. Taking the phone in one of his hands, Norman began shouting to the system so that all the money should be spent on upgrading the martial art to its full level. He began the process of ascending to the next level of martial arts proficiency. The villain only grinned because Norman would not be able to withstand a battle with an elevated level anyway. He struck, but to his surprise, the hero managed to block and seize the initiative. The main character himself was glad that his plan worked, and now the initiative in the fight passed to him. the hero fended off the villain's blow, saying that now, after ascending, their power levels are equal. The enemy was extremely annoyed by this development and attacked Norman with greater force and fury. Then their blows connected, creating a flash of light and releasing a wave of air. Norman and the villain were thrown to different sides of the room, while the bandit's hand got stuck in the wall, preventing him from striking. Our hero realized that this was only in his hands, and he needed to strike as quickly as possible with all his might. Norman decided to use the Bloodhawk endless barrage technique, striking 1,000 times at once. The bandit was still able to strike the hero with one free hand, sending him flying again. Norman just landed neatly on the bookcase, mocking his opponent for his weakness. Continuing to insult the enemy, he began to prepare for a new attack, transferring all his strength into his fist. Trying to defend himself, the villain finally saw that his hand was stuck in the wall. As soon as the enemy realized his position, the main character had already flown up to him and struck. The blow was so strong that the wall behind the villain was broken, and this time the bandit was in flight. Having tried to get up, the criminal realized that he could not get up from his knees, which was surprising. As it turned out, the technique he uses, the power of the beast, protects him from minor damage, but it takes too much strength and energy to cause large damage. The main character immediately understood the nuance of this technique, and therefore deliberately delivered many weak blows at first, and then a strong one. And the main character, completely angry for his friends, transferred all his strength into his fists and delivered many strong blows. The blows were so strong that the villain simply fell exhausted to the first floor. Soon the police arrived and took away all the criminals, and the leader was put in special handcuffs that limit the use of techniques. And again the main character found himself at the head of the police station, just like a few days ago. Suddenly their dialogue was interrupted by one of the police with the results of the DNA analysis and fingerprints of the leader. As it turned out, he was a criminal who had escaped from prison and worked for someone higher up. Our hero decided not to waste the opportunity and asked instead of a monetary reward to give him the opportunity to work on this case. At this time, Kane, lying in the hospital from his injuries, was talking as if to himself. As it turns out, he has approximately the same system as the main character, but designed for good deeds. Suddenly, his conversation with the system was interrupted by a sudden ringing of the phone that was lying next to him on the cabinet. It was Rena who found out about his well-being and that she, Nola, and Norman wanted to visit him. In parallel with all the events, Herman's headquarters had already heard rumors about the unsuccessful operation. He tried to reassure his subordinates because nothing terrible had happened, and the police did not know where they were. Here his dialogue was interrupted by the IT specialist, who was frightened by the blocked accounts. It was clear that Herman was very angry with the outcome of events, and was coming up with a plan for revenge on the main character. As it turned out, those who blocked the accounts were the Parker family, and they did it at Rena's request. Norman, who was nearby at the time, thanked Rena for her help and that the time had come for him to move. There was chaos at the villains' headquarters, as everyone was afraid that they would soon be found and arrested. German decided to go to the toilet to supposedly think about what to do next, leaving his subordinates in the room. Then the police burst into the headquarters, ordering everyone to surrender in an amicable way or they would open fire. At this time, Herman, having collected his things, fled from the headquarters because he knew that they had already left for them. But Norman was already waiting for him in the gateway, who had calculated this outcome of events. Herman began to blackmail the main character and offer money to hush up the case. Norman turned on his acting skills and began to pretend that he was not against the proposal in principle. Instantly, as soon as Norm was distracted, Herman shot the key at him like a dart. But the main character expected such an action from the villain and masterfully dodged it by jumping onto the air conditioner. At the same moment, police officers and the chief surrounded the alley, ordering Herman to surrender in an amicable way. The police found where the criminal was thanks to the fact that Norman sent a geotag to the head when meeting with Herman. Leaving with the police, Herman whispered to the hero that victory was not yet close and that he was just a cog in the machine. Already at home, Nola asked Norman how much he earned for capturing criminals. Shifting to an unpleasant topic, the main character asked his friend what job she would earn the most from, and she answered that if she was a nanny. The main character suggested opening a martial arts center, since Nola knows the theory very well, although the level of practice is 0. Nola immediately refused due to her uncertainty, as soon as the main character offered her a teacher's robe. But Norman knew how mercantile his girlfriend was and offered 10% of the center's revenue. After some time, the martial arts center was opened, advertising which was done on the street. As expected, Nola is an excellent teacher due to his knowledge of martial arts theory. A month later, Norman asked Nola, dressed as a maid, to give him a checkbook for his salary. Taking the book, the main character began to collect expenses and profits from the martial arts center. Suddenly, Rena came with not very positive news. They wanted to kick Norman out of school. The main character couldn't believe it because he has official leave, and he does all his homework. As it turns out, Norman broke 13 rules, 3 of which are the most important. Norman was surprised, because they promised to turn a blind eye to him if he did well. And in general, he is not a hooligan and did everything within the law, without crossing the line. Their dialogue was interrupted by Nola, who offered a bottle of water to Rena, but Norman could not wait. To which Rena yelled that she couldn't calmly take a sip of water. Having calmed down and taken a sip from a bottle of water, Rena continued to report that there were no important grounds for exclusion, and that it is obvious that someone is deliberately trying to frame Norman because of recent events. The main character decided to go himself and find out what was the matter together with Rena, leaving Nola in charge in the center. Half a day later, the friends were already returning to the center, while the sun was carefully setting behind the horizon, hidden because of the tall buildings. Suddenly, Rena stopped and began to say that she was very worried about the main character. Norman tried to reassure her that he wouldn't just give up, and those who arranged all this would greatly regret it. Returning to the center, Norman and Rena froze in shock as the door to the center was sealed by the authorities. As Nola said, people from the government came to check the documents, and finding out that they were not there, they sealed the premises and closed the center. Rena instantly found out who set them up. It was a black cloak, which the main character had really annoyed. She said that Herman warned the main character about him when he said that he had gotten involved in all this in vain. Suddenly it dawned on Norman that the cloak was taking revenge on him for swatting his people. Our hero even more decided to deal with all the offenders so that he could live in peace. In the end, he asked Rena to make more connections to find out more about this cloak. At home, Norman lay on the sofa and thought about his next steps, since the end of the war was not planned for any time soon. He also thought about how he could earn money to further improve his skills. Suddenly, Nola returned home with good news, which made the main character immensely happy. The girl came home with books purchased at a discount with various techniques that still needed to be studied. After a long time of studying books, it turned out that most of them were useless. Suddenly, Nola found a normally written book detailing a technique called camouflage. The technique made it possible to change the appearance of body parts at the request of the master. And, in theory, it was possible to completely change your personality and voice. After 15 minutes of reading, I learned that the technique does not require chi energy to learn and use. This arrangement suited Norman, so he quickly grabbed the book from Nola's hands for self-study. He has already come up with the use of this technique, and besides, for pumping, you can do without recovery capsules. Arriving at the bank, Norman decided to take out a loan to upgrade his skills. But unfortunately, a ban was issued in his name, even though the bank approved loans to everyone he met. As soon as Norman told who he was, the bank employee immediately remembered that the director was waiting for him. She apologized and asked to follow the main character to the office of the bank director. Already in the office, Norman was indignant at why he was not approved for a loan, because he could pay everything back. The director offered the hero a loan of $70,000 at a very high interest rate and for 3 months. The main character agreed to these conditions and, getting up from his chair, extended his hand as a sign of agreement. As soon as the director shook Norm's hand, the hero's hand was squeezed with terrifying force. Norman laughed it off, saying that the director was also a practitioner, although he himself knew that he was the right hand of the cloak. As soon as the main character left the office, the director, whose name was Patrick, again discussed the plan to sink Norman. The hero himself, standing outside the bank, threatened to return and get even with Patrick. After all, now he could, thanks to money and a book, develop a camouflage technique that would help him penetrate the main ranks of the cloak. In the evening, Norman and Nola came to their favorite restaurant to have a delicious meal. But to the surprise of the main character, the employees closed the restaurant in front of the hero's noses. Nola recalled that the previous time Norman ate almost all the food in this restaurant. Before the couple went out to eat, Norman decided to upgrade his hawk strike technique to the maximum, as money allowed. Before pumping, he took a chi restoration pill, and surprisingly, after the end of the process, Norman had almost no strength left, despite the pill. The vital energy level was so low that the main character was ready to start eating out of the toilet. Returning from the memories to the present, Nola again reminded Norman of duty. Arriving at another restaurant, the main character assured that this time he would pay the bill himself. Nola looked at the hero with suspicion, although she was very hungry. Norman explained that after this she would not owe him anything, because she had already helped him with training in camouflage techniques. After discussing their differences, the heroes began their meal while discussing the next steps of action. 2 days later, Norman finally discovered the camouflage technique, which the system notified him of. Having learned the cost of upgrading this equipment, Norman was saddened by such a high cost. But since he has taken on this task, he must finish it to the end, and he ordered the system to convert all his money into skill points. The pumping was successful. To check this, Norman changed the appearance of his hand and was ready to use it in practice. After a 2-day investigation, Norman learned about the daily routine of Patrick, the bank's director and the Cape's right-hand man. Standing in the way of the director's car in his new guise, he forced him to abruptly stop the car. Naturally, Patrick was angry about this and insulted the main character, whom he did not recognize due to the disguise technique. Patrick began to warn the stranger that he had stood in the way in vain, and these would be his last seconds. Approaching closer, the director offered to say the last words to the stranger before his death. But Norman, under the face of a stranger, was faster and delivered a strong kick. Patrick blocked the main character's blow, although it was difficult to do so. Norman, after the blow, decided to take off his mask, show who he was, and pretended to be Henry. From Patrick's surprise and cry, the main character learned that his brother Henry was the Black Cloak. Naturally, Patrick, as Henry's right hand, began to find out what he was doing here, what kind of sudden check. Getting into the car together, Patrick immediately began talking about the latest case, which he gradually began to do. Having somehow completed the initial dialogue, Norman, in the guise of Henry, asked him to give him all the bank's documentation. As it turned out, Patrick expected such a request and always carried all the documents with him in his briefcase. Norman gladly took the briefcase, praising Patrick on behalf of Henry. The next step was to give a new task to Patrick, so that he would leave the game without knowing it. The main character demanded to throw out all the devices and destroy the SIM card, go to another city, and get a job as an ordinary builder. Patrick was glad to have such an important task, so that same day he began a new task, flying on an airplane. After that, Norman changed his appearance to Patrick and came to the bank. Entering the main office, the main character began to look around in search of something valuable. Before the whole process, he called the secretary and asked not to enter or let anyone into the office for 2 hours. The hero noticed a safe with jewelry in the corner of the office, which was successfully opened. Realizing that the money would take a long time to convert, he took the packet and began the process. After some time, strange sounds began to be heard from the office, as if someone was breaking something. As it turns out, it was Norman who broke all the data. 2 things, all the documents in order to ruin the bank, while keeping the camera and flash drive to record a video message on behalf of Patrick. In Henry's office, the original Henry himself watched the message from the false Patrick about all the criminal operations and the declassification of the name of the Black Cloak. Together with him, the assistant watched this appeal, trying not to show fear until the last moment. After the video ended, the assistant turned to Henry, asking what he would do next and what steps he would take. Without answering his assistant, Norman's brother called his gangsters and tried to find out where Patrick himself was. Unfortunately for him, Patrick suddenly disappeared somewhere, and because of this, Henry demanded that Patrick's corpse be brought to him within 3 months. Patrick himself did not know at all what was happening in the capital and was carrying out a false order from Norman. The next morning, Norman talked about recent events while practicing his techniques. He rejoiced at how he developed his skills in a short time after opening the donation system. Having learned the price for the subsequent upgrade of the Hawk Strike technique, the main character exhaled heavily. Taking out a pack of Chi restoration pills, Norman ordered his system to increase the Hawk Strike to maximum. The process had begun, development was taking place, and in the eyes of the hero there was rage from the granted power. In the end, he decided to try the blow on a cobblestone, and to his surprise, the cobblestone simply cracked from the force of the blow. Once again, Norman's spirits were lifted by the force of his blow and the force he received. The next step was to achieve one of 3 skill levels in order to reopen the martial arts center. Already at the inspection center, Nola was waiting for the main character while he underwent a medical examination. The doctor, after the examination, told Norman that his heart density level was average and he was allowed to take the exam. Leaving the doctor's office joyfully, Norman took great pleasure in telling Nola what would happen next. The next step was to obtain Mastery Category E1. Their dialogue was interrupted by a strange man who walked past them as if he was eavesdropping. At this time, Henry and his accomplice, Artie, were quietly drinking in a street eatery. They discussed the latest events of the bank's closure and Henry's declassification. Suddenly, their pleasant dialogue was interrupted by a call on Artie's phone from one of his assistants. As it turned out, his people found out that Norman was planning to take E alone, which Henry was extremely surprised by. Henry didn't understand how he was allowed in, since even gifted practitioners couldn't reach that level of skill. Artie decided to propose a plan to stop Norman, because he is the head of a network of mastery testing centers. Artie assured Herman that everything would be fine and Norman would not be able to pass the proficiency test. The next morning, Norman decided to make breakfast for both of them at once, since Nola had been living with him for a long time. As it turned out, from a short dialogue, the main character may have mixed up the exam dates. In the examination center, one after another, those who wanted to pass the exam flew out of the ring. The judges sat and wondered where our main character was because today he was supposed to come. And so the hero and his girlfriend stood near the doors to the center. Artie, sitting on the judge's stand, asked his henchman where Norman was. He was indignant at how it was possible to be so late, because he had hired a very strong and unbalanced examiner as practice for the exam. And so the main character opens the large doors to the center to take the mastery exam. But suddenly it's not Norman who comes into the center, but some other guy who was late for the change. Artie was very annoyed by this turn, because the costs were too high and went nowhere. Then he sensed a catch and with a shout sent one of his assistants to check where Norman was renting. As it turned out, the main character specifically took the exam in another city because he suspected fraud. The main character and his girlfriend Nola made their way back in the evening, again discussing debts. Already at night, Henry called Artie to find out how the surrender went and whether it was possible to overwhelm his brother. Henry, hearing that Norman had outsmarted them, seemed to have expected this, and calmly hung up the phone, staring at the moon. He took out a nearby mirror and pointed it at the moon so that the light from it was carefully reflected from the mirror surface. The next day, Henry was training in the warehouse with himself, like a clone. The sounds of blows and screams from Henry's training could be heard throughout the warehouse. As it turned out, it was not a clone of Henry, but a special training robot that completely replicates the original person. 2 years ago, Henry was nothing more than a useless practitioner who was constantly bullied. But at one point, everything changed, and he suddenly became a martial arts genius, replacing the heir. This all happened thanks to the heavenly exchange system, which made it possible to exchange jewelry for various rare things. Some of these things are more significant and have different magical effects. Parallel to his monologue, he held a deactivated training android. After a while, Henry knocked on his father's office as he called him to talk. The father, having learned about the situation with the bank and the disclosure of his identity, scolded Henry. The old man understood that Henry was in this way trying to take power in the Osborne family, and out of anger hit him on the cheek with his cane. After which he ordered Henry to send an invitation to Norman back to the family. There were guests in Norman's house, namely a messenger from his father, who called him back home. Norman doubted the sincerity of this invitation, because the old man always thought only of the benefit of the family. And yet, the main character agreed to come to his father's mansion, understanding what would happen there. As soon as the guest left, Norman lay down on the sofa and began to talk about his father. In the old man's heart, there was only the status of family, although perhaps there were still traces of his father's love in his heart. When Nola asked why he was returning to the family then, Norman, with full eyes of rage, replied that he did not want Henry to become the heir. The next day, a large crowd gathered at the Osborne mansion to celebrate Norman's return to the family. The trio stood out separately, led by a director who was too young. They discussed how good it was that the Osborne company had gotten rid of the old directors. Norman, who overheard this dialogue, interrupted the trio, because the previous directors had worked for the Osborne family for 20 years, and they were so easily gotten rid of. The young director approached Norman to say hello. The main character, in response, only asked the question that he really became a director due to his skills. The young director was discouraged by this question, and Norman calmly walked further into the crowd. Suddenly, an old man began speaking through the microphone, greeting and thanking everyone who had arrived for the holiday. As he continues his monologue, he hopes everyone has a good time at the Osborne family celebration. The main purpose of this celebration was to bring Norman back to his family. After these words, the entire crowd turned their attention to Norman, standing in the middle of everyone. As soon as Norman took the stage, his father raised his hand as a sign of his long-awaited return to the family. The next topic of the speech was the appointment of a new heir to the Osborne family after Norman's return. The crowd gave their choice to Henry since he bribed or sponsored many. Only one expressed the idea that Norman would again become the head, but they immediately began to condemn him. The main character did not understand what his father really wanted from him. However, he remembered what kind of father he was, and most likely the old man wants the brothers to fight for the place. Suddenly, the hero noticed that the crowd was ignoring him, as if everyone disliked him. Suddenly, Henry approached him and invited Norman to talk, but the hero himself did not want this. Henry insisted, because he was interested in how it happened that Norman developed so quickly in martial arts. Arriving in a separate room, Norman tried to lie as best as possible and hide the real reason for receiving powers. Suddenly, he was attracted by the commotion in the courtyard. The crowd was shouting that Norman was a murderer due to an incomprehensible situation. As soon as the main character was distracted, Henry decided to strike him, as if he was deliberately waiting for the moment. But Norman managed to catch his brother's fist and began to demand that he explain what was happening. Suddenly, an angry crowd burst into the room, wanting to tear Norman apart because of the murder of the old man. The crowd accused the main character of deciding to kill his father out of a sense of revenge, and that he killed him in front of everyone, without hiding at all. Norman couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe that the old man was dead, because despite everything, he appreciated him. Henry, taking advantage of the moment, hit our hero in the face with all his might in front of all the guests. Norman's brother supported the crowd, as if he himself had arranged all this with the murder of his father. The main character at this time tried to get up after the blow, because he was slammed into the wall with all his might. Henry continued to pour kerosene into the anger and rage of the crowd, who were already ready to kill Norman on the spot. He began to order everyone to surround and capture our hero so that he would not escape justice. But Norman wasted no time and had already jumped out the window straight into the pool in the yard. Herman responded by ordering guards to be sent to the pool to capture the fugitive. 15 minutes later, people returned and said that they found no one in the pool, as if Norman had fallen through the ground. Henry, angry, went out to the crowd to try to calm the guests and remind them that his father did not have time to choose an heir. Suddenly, a living old man appeared among the crowd, which frightened all the guests, as he fell dead in front of everyone. The old man said that he expected an assassination attempt and deliberately pretended to be dead in front of everyone. Henry allegedly began to be angry with Norman, saying that he almost achieved the death of his father. The old man refuted the theory that it was Norman who committed the assassination attempt, since it was he who warned him about the possible assassination attempt. Henry still tried to convince his father because there were witnesses to the assassination attempt, and they confirmed the version with Norman. As soon as the father said that the killer was in fact still among them, everyone immediately tensed up and began to look at each other. The old man himself fell silent for a while, looking carefully at everyone present. The young director could not stand the pressure and asked what they should do now. After a long silence, the old man added that no one would be released until this case was investigated. In the basement of the house was the main character himself, dressed in his father's clothes and the body of a Stark. Norman promised to find the killer and avenge his father's death. As it turned out, the one who came out to the crowd was Norman himself, who, with the help of disguise techniques, could transform into his father. The main character suspected that the assassination attempt was planned by Henry and wanted to ensure his death. While the old man was away, the crowd discussed among themselves different versions of who the killer really was. Henry approached his father when he returned and began to try again to convince the old man that Norman had planned all this. Suddenly, the old man angrily told everyone to shut up and listen to what he had to say. Then he asked Henry where he was during the assassination attempt. Henry nervously replied that he was upstairs, to which he received a hard blow with a bottle due to the lie. Wiping his hand after the blow, the old man added that he gave his son a chance to answer honestly, but he did not take it. After which he turned to the guards, finding out where they were, and they all replied that they had left their posts on Henry's orders. Everyone gradually understood that they had blamed Norman in vain and that Henry was the real killer. After all this, the old man said that only 2 young directors chased after Norman, which proved their loyalty. The young directors thought that this was praise, and so they immediately replied that it was their job and they did what you should. But they both changed their faces as soon as the headmaster said that they had proven their loyalty to Henry and not to the Osborne family. Henry felt sweat pour down his face and his eyes widen in fear. Henry began to tell his father that it was all a misunderstanding, that they had to catch Norman first. But the old man immediately interrupted him with a shout. He began to ask that Henry wanted to become the head so much that he was ready to kill his father and brother. The crowd, having listened to the old man, began to understand more and more that the murder of the old man was the work of Henry. Although Henry understood that his minor mistakes turned into huge problems, he still tried to justify himself. Then Joseph, one of the old man's close associates, lifted Henry into the air with the help of his technique. Henry continued to make excuses, saying that there were still many doubts about this, and also that there was no evidence. But the old man only replied that in the Osborne family all his words were evidence. Henry realized that he would not be able to resist Uncle Joseph's bloodline brain technique, so he used his trump card, which was teleportation. Suddenly, the entire room was blinded by a bright white flash, causing everyone to close their eyes. Joseph used his technique in an attempt to stop the fleeing Henry, but right at that moment, when the hand was almost catching Henry, he teleported. Joseph, stunned by Henry's escape, asked himself how this was possible. The old man angrily asked Joseph where Henry was. Joseph answered him guiltily that Henry managed to escape. Joseph, after all the old man's angry reprimands, said that he had already activated his blood search skill, but he could not sense Henry within a radius of 1 kilometer. The old man, leaving to deal with everything, asked another of his employees, Chris, to stay in the room, calm the guests, and then let them go, and ordered Joseph to go with him. Our attention moves to the backyard where the old man and Joseph have arrived. The head stood and said displeasedly that Henry, for the sake of the title of heir, decided to kill him and his brother. When he finished, he told Joseph to tell the police everything, because Henry had to be caught, and if he resisted, he allowed him to shoot to kill. Next, the old man said that his double's body should be frozen, and after Henry's capture, they would bury him. After this conversation, we are transported to the house, where the old man goes up to Henry's room to search. The main character, who had taken off his disguise, was standing and looking around the room when he suddenly discovered a suspicious box in the table. He immediately went, and with a sharp movement of his hand opened it. Inside was a book. The book said that Henry bought quite a lot of strange things. Then the main character was very surprised, because Henry, just like he had a system, His system is called the Divine Exchange System. After receiving such unexpected information, Norman decided to ask the system whether there were others like it. After an affirmative answer from the system, Norm decided to ask how many systems there are. But the system did not answer this question, because the number is unknown, and it cannot disseminate information without permission. After a series of various questions to which the system did not give precise answers, he decided to ask about the functions of other systems. The system also did not give an exact answer, but said that its functions are unique, and there is no need to worry about it. To which Norm said that this is cool and called the system his son. Norman explained this by saying that the system could not exist without him, which means the origin is the mother of the system. Norm is the father. After a series of questions about Henry's system and the lack of answers to them, Norm realized that everything would be solved by the land that Henry bought. Norm, in the guise of the old man, decided to ask his driver, whom Joseph had brought, about where Henry had gone. The driver said that Henry takes a car every month for a couple of days, but he doesn't say where he goes. But one day he didn't erase the navigator history, and the driver saw a location in the abandoned outskirts. That same night, Henry, in the guise of an old man and several other people, including Joseph, arrived at the factory site that Henry had purchased. They immediately went to the door to go inside. As they got closer, they discovered a strange thing on the door that looked like a face scanner. Joseph tried to destroy the door with his technique, but he failed. Norm came to the conclusion that this was an item from another world that Henry had purchased using the Divine Exchange System. Norman sent all the people home, saying that he wanted to be alone, and deciding that the old man was sad because Henry had left. Immediately after they left, Norm returned to his form and tried to simply push the door, but it did not open. After many attempts, the main character came up with an interesting idea. He turned into his brother Henry and scanned his face. The door did not recognize the change and calmly opened. The main character was already very happy inside, because there were a lot of interesting things in the room. But Norm forgot to close the door, and his protagonist's glee was interrupted by the appearance of another man who looked just like the protagonist. Norman approached the man, who turned out to be the android that Henry had bought. Since Norm was in the guise of Henry, the android mistook him for the owner and calmly went to charge the thing that looked like a key. At the moment when Norman examined the android, he activated and asked what order, which scared the main character. Norm pretended to the android that he had a bad memory and forgot what the last order he gave, so he asked to be reminded. 15 minutes later, Norman decided to return to his form because it was more comfortable. Norm also came up with a way to transfer the rights of the android. He would simply turn into Henry and give the rights to his real appearance. The main character walked around the room trying to figure out whether to call Joseph or not. After some thought, Norman decided that it would be easier for him to be alone, and also that he should take revenge personally. A little later, Henry arrived at the factory. He walked and thought that his amulet, although useful, teleports to a random place, and also has a limit of uses, which Henry has exhausted. Henry went inside, talking to himself about how good it was that the robot was back, because with the resources, he could regain power. He asked the android, who was in the form of Norm, to return to his normal form, because Henry was enraged by the sight of Norman. But then Henry realizes that the android could not get inside on its own. As soon as he realized this, the android quickly made his strike. The android locked onto the target and activated its pursuit missiles. Henry was thrown back by a powerful explosion from the rockets. As soon as Henry came to his senses, the robot immediately attacked him, forcing him to use a protective amulet, which broke due to the blow. The android and Henry, who was holding the amulet in his hand, ran towards each other. After some time, the android was defeated. Henry was beside himself with rage, because he was not only attacked by his own robot, but also forced to use a precious amulet of protection. Then the main character came out holding Henry's things in his hands. The main character quickly began to attack Henry, forcing him to dodge. Norman wanted to kill Henry with his own things, but in the process, he realized that he just wanted to fight to the death. Norm's next attack resulted in a very powerful explosion, but Henry was able to block this attack. He began to ask why Norman stopped and say that only he can effectively use these items. Now Henry himself decided to attack Norm using the tiger's fist, while saying that now it was his turn. But Norman decided not to block the blow, but met it with a powerful blow to Henry's face. Henry did not give up. He decided to attack using the technique of bringing the tiger down the mountain. However, the protagonist also counterattacked Henry with a powerful blow to the body. Norman began to beat Henry, devoting the blows to various reasons, namely that he was ungrateful, that he sent people to mock Norman. Henry, after a series of blows from Norman, flew out of the factory, while thinking that he had reached the 3rd level, trained a lot, but still could not fight back. Henry quickly walked towards Norman to strike, telling him not to pretend to be noble and think that he had won. But the next moment, Henry was sent flying thanks to Norman's blow. After Henry landed on the ground, Norm began to slam his face into the ground with all his might for being an unworthy son who had committed so many crimes. Having finished his work, the main character simply said the words directed to the old man that he had made Henry pay for what he had done. Suddenly, a strange thing began to appear from the body. It turned out to be a mirror. The main character assumed that this was the system of divine exchange. Suddenly, the mirror began to shake as if it wanted to escape. After asking the system what was wrong with the mirror, she said that the mirror had inherited the enemy's sense of fear. After the system said that the thing was afraid of it, Norman came to the conclusion that the system level was different from the others. The system responded to this by saying that it is a concept of laws from another world, and not just an imitator. The main character, shaking the mirror, decided to ask the system whether this mirror is a divine exchange system. After answering that the mirror was just a subsystem, Norm still thought it was better than nothing and decided to find out how to use it. The system reported that after Norman signed an agreement with it, he lost the ability to enter into agreements with others. The system also said that it has a kind of garbage container, and added that the mirror can be recycled for a huge amount of money. The system said that Norm could simply terminate the agreement with her, but Norman gave her the name Becca and said that they would be like family, and he would not trade her for anything. Then the system said that the mirror could be sold for $4 million. The main character asked whether the object would disappear later, to which the system gave an affirmative answer. Norm, realizing that this was wasteful, decided to ask whether another person could take possession of the mirror. And when the hero heard an affirmative answer, he was very happy because he could make money from it. After some time, Norman, in the guise of the old man, returned to the estate. At the estate, Norm pretended to go take the old man's medicine because Joseph reminded him to. The main character, thanks to the found cure for the heart and the transformation of the robot, arranged the death of Chief Osborne from a heart attack. The main character himself appeared before everyone 2 weeks before the master's death, and appeared to everyone. Norman stood over the grave and could not hold back his tears, thanks to which he realized the connection between his father and his children. The main character thought with tears in his eyes that even if he did not call the old man father, his blood still flows in his veins. Norm fell to his knees, saying to himself that he would avenge the master, that now it was all over, and then shouted out loud only one word, namely father. After some time, Norman asked Uncle Joseph and the others to return first and allow him to be alone with his father. The main character sat at the grave until nightfall, and left only when the android crawled out of the ground. After all this, the main character inherited the position of head of the Osborne family, although many are against this, believing that Norm is still a child. But thanks to Uncle Joseph, he can calmly go about his business. To accelerate the pace of development of the company, it was necessary to borrow money from the bank. But despite thoughts about whether it makes sense to invest in the corporation, the main character solved the problem with the bank. Since Norman does not understand business, he has to ask Nola for help. She is very diligent, but asks for a high salary. The company has difficulties, but Norm knows how to interest her. The thing that the main character gave away turned out to be a divine exchange system. When asked why the main character did not keep it for himself, he replied that he had to offer a valuable item to the most valuable employee. But Nola quickly recognized the lie, and the main character said that this thing would suit her better. Then he suggested the option of dividing the profit 7-3, which Nola agreed with. Having received consent, Norm took Nola to the things that he found from Henry, saying that the system was based on barter, and this was its initial capital. An hour later, Nola got in touch with the merchant, who was at first surprised that there was a girl in front of him, but then said that he didn't care. Knowing that Nola is stingy and therefore very difficult to deceive, the main character went to rest. In the morning, Norm woke up and found Nola, who had not slept all night. She showed a device for creating pills that doubled strength for 15 minutes. She explained that they have 3 effects, namely laughter. If you laugh, the effect will disappear. Constipation. After 15 minutes, a stomachache will appear and sleep. After the effect disappears, you will sleep for half a day. After listening to all this, Norman began shouting to Nola about whether this was a defective item and that it was useless. But the girl said that even if the sleep and indigestion pills are not so perfect, the laughter pill is just something. After some time, Nola bought a new transformation master because Henry's android consumed a lot of energy and was inconvenient to charge. The main character decided to create a laughter pill. According to the merchant, the pill master absorbs the energy of heaven and earth, creating purified pills. Norm noticed that the pills could not be used to harden the body and to improve the level of martial arts. And Norm also noticed the posture when producing pills, which was reminiscent of going to the toilet. Next, our main character was thinking about how to make money on pills. But Nola distracted him, saying that a person was looking for Norma. This person turned out to be Director Yang, who came to ask Norm to take part in the martial arts exchange. The main character reminded him that his education was suspended, but the director said that the school admitted guilt, and that he did not want to do this. The director asked Norm if he agreed, but the hero suggested that they drink tea first. Director Young, remembering Norm's greed and commercialism, said that for second place he would pay Norman $138,000. And the director turned out to be right. Norm immediately agreed, but noticed that the director underestimated him because the hero only has an E certificate. The main character's face changed when he learned that there would be 2 third-ranked students and 1 E1 at the event. Every year before the college entrance examination, schools hold a martial arts exchange meeting. Among the 9 schools, there are also geniuses. Every year they show their skills, but this time it will be even greater. Last year, Henry competed for Ian's school, but this time Norman, who is stronger than him, will compete. Loon High School, which came first last year, has E1 student Glenn this time. Our attention turns to Glenn, who is calmly meditating. Suddenly, an unknown person attacks him from behind, but stops the blow. This person said that his concentration has become higher, but this is not enough to reach the level of a righteous mind. It turned out that this man was his father, and he warned him that there would be another student with an E certificate alone in the competition. After this information, Glenn became somewhat tense. Next, we see a student from the Nan school who is training hard. After the teacher says that Jim is the most talented person he has ever met, he asks to repeat the training again. As Jim dealt quick blows to the teacher's palms, Jim spoke about how he would not let the teacher down. Next, we see a chicken dancing to the music, but her head is immediately cut off with a cleaver. The person who killed the chicken has a killer system that requires killing creatures. The stronger the creature, the more points. After investing points for killing a chicken into attack power, he happily thought only that he, with the first level, was stronger than people with the third. But since the points he gets for killing chickens are not enough, he realizes that he needs to kill another creature. Next, we are shown a car where Kane and another student named Charlie are talking. The main character listened to their conversation and thought that Kane was just as kind, which was good. The car was driven by their school's level 9 teacher, Justin, who reminded Norm not to be arrogant. Norman stated with full confidence that he does not underestimate his opponents. Even if he is a weakling, he will give his best. The teacher said that Glenn from Loon School lost to Henry, but Glenn was only a second year at the school at that time. The teacher continued talking. He said that Jim from Nan's school last time fought with Henry for an hour and barely defeated him. Our heroes arrived at the right place, but Kane noticed that it was just a lake. But the teacher said to just wait. Other teachers approached Teacher Justin to say that there was a lot of talent at the Ian school. Last year it was Henry, and this year it was Norm, who was even stronger. Kane and Charlie looked at the main character, who was talking to the girls, saying that it was cool to be an E certificate alone and be surrounded by girls. Suddenly, Kane tensed, not understanding what this sensation was. After the hero system reported that it had discovered a natural enemy in the killer system, Kane saw its owner. However, the guy with the killer system did not understand which of the 3 students at the Yan school had the hero system. But the situation was diffused by helicopters on which the last 2 martial arts schools arrived. Teacher Ben and the students of the Long School descended on the Bridge of Bloody Essence. The teacher was full of confidence that this year they would also be leaders. On the second bridge, the teacher and students of Nan's school descended, whose teacher asked Teacher Ben not to rush to conclusions. After both schools descended to the ground, the main character was called out by one of the students. It was Glenn. He told Norm that he had heard about him, and hoped that he would not disappoint him. At the same time, the school teacher Nan told Jim that he had watched Norman and realized that he was strong, and his movements were fast and confident, and that he was not much weaker than Glenn, and asked him to be careful. Jim, listening to this, immediately listened to the teacher and agreed. Here, sitting in the air as if on the floor, an unfamiliar old man appeared and asked to move 10 meters away from the lake. All the students were stunned and delighted by his appearance. They could not understand how he managed to sit in the air. Justin, standing next to Norman, answered Norm's question about who this old man was. The teacher said that it was Ralph, one of the permanent directors of the Central Martial Arts Association. When everyone moved away from the lake, Ralph unexpectedly raised an island hidden under the lake. The guy with the killer system, looking at this, asked himself frustratedly why the system wouldn't allow him to practice like a normal person. Kane, who was also watching this, thought about how many good things he could do if he had such power. Our main character, also watching this, was thinking about body tempering and that if he reached 99 small levels in the main, then what would happen if he received a heavenly level? On the raised Hue Island, which was purchased by 9 schools for the purpose of holding martial arts exchange competitions there. The main character sitting in the hotel read the rules of the competition. The rules are simple, only 15 rounds where students of any school can challenge students of other schools. The winner takes all the points of the loser. If the loser has no points, the winner is given 1 point. Having finished reading, the main character thought that all the participants in the competition were his potential clients. The main character, who was already on the phone, thought that if he wants to sell pills, then he can't show his face, so he creates the identity of an alchemy master. We are transported to a student who received a message from Norm, but he did not believe it. Already in Norman's room, we see how the main character is angry because no one takes his word for it. Having calmed down, the main character simply sent the meeting address to the students. Norm, wearing a rooster mask, came to the meeting place, where 3 guys were already waiting for him. He threw them berserker pills, and while the guys were asking questions, he quietly left. The person who gave the pills was not Norm, but a transformation master, whom the main character used for safety purposes. The first day of the competition arrived. The teachers stood on the stage and talked about how they would draw lots to determine the serial number of the participants. School teacher Young, standing on stage, received the first number for his school. Charlie, who decided to go first, defeated his opponent using the third hand-to-hand combat technique. After the fight, the teacher praised Charlie, saying that he apparently did not neglect his training. Next, Justin gave instructions to Kane and Norm, asking them to choose opponents they could defeat in order to score points. Next up was Kane, who had no trouble defeating his opponent thanks to his reflection barrier technique. Other students watching this fight were discussing the last 2 victories and how terrible Norm was then. The last to speak was our main character, standing on stage and thinking about who he should choose. By random selection, he chose the same student who did not believe Norm yesterday. Carl went up on stage but asked Norman to go easy on him. But the main character said that he could not do this because fighting not at full strength is an insult to the martial arts themselves. Jim admired Norman's dedication to the martial arts. Glenn also said that only a true martial artist would be able to do this to his opponent. In the arena itself, Carl asked Norm to at least not hit him in the face. After this, our main character quickly defeated Carl, while of course not listening to the request. Norman, still standing on stage watching Carl being taken away by paramedics, thought about the reason for his choice. The main one being that he was the kind of person who would let off his steam on others. Next we see Glenn, who also effortlessly defeated the opponent he chose. Jim also defeated his opponent without much difficulty. Glenn, watching Jim's fight, realized that this was a message to him. At this moment, Norman stood with his eyes closed and thought about Bill, Frank, and Alex, to whom he sold the pills, but they did not accept them. Alex had already been defeated by Carl. Bill came out next, defeating his opponent on his own. The main character was very unhappy about this, thinking that he would have been better off taking the pill. The last one was Frank, standing on stage with complete confidence. But Frank also won with his own powers, so the protagonist was furious, wondering why they didn't trust his pills. But then Alex entered the arena, wanting to fight Carl again. Carl accepted the challenge and jumped into the arena with a sharp jump. Alex immediately began to rapidly attack Carl. Carl was forced to only dodge and block because Alex hit him with quite powerful blows. Carl couldn't understand what was happening. He was thinking about why Alex had become so strong. Carl, speaking of that, even if Alex hid his strength, he is still not his opponent. But unexpectedly for Carl, Alex with a sharp movement appeared behind his back. Carl was defeated for the second time that day. This fight was good for Norm, because Frank and Bill realized that the berserker pill really worked. Our attention is again transferred to the arena, where Jack has already ascended with the killer system. Jack, believing in himself, challenged Kane. The fight began with Jack attacking with his first hand-to-hand combat technique. The school's teachers, Lung and Nan, watching the fight, discussed whether such a simple attack could be so powerful. But Kane, to the surprise of the teachers, was able to block Jack's attacks. Kane continued to dodge Jack as he attacked him. Kane, having finished dodging, attacked Jack with a powerful blow to the body. Norman, who was watching the fight, wondered how Kane could become stronger in a couple of days. Kane and Jack's fists collided, showing that Kane has excellent defense and is not afraid of Jack's attacks. Jack, realizing that this was his first battle and that he could not lose, attacked Kane with a crossbow technique. But Kane blocked this attack with his barrier of reflections. Immediately after Jack bounced off the barrier, Kane landed a powerful body kick. Kane won the fight, and Norman and Charlie came to support him. Jack, thanks to this battle, realized that he could not sit idly by. Already in the room, Norman began to receive messages in which they wanted to contact him to buy berserk pills. Carl even wrote to him, but Norm, who was angry with him, simply blocked him. Already at night, Norman's android in a rooster mask accepted money for the purchase of pills. After the android returned to Norm, he sat happy because he was able to earn more than $28,000. The second day of the competition began. 2 students were already fighting in the arena. Teacher Ben, watching the fight, could not understand how his student could be pushed aside by some third-rate fighter. He began to suspect that there were too many people here whose strength was different from the information they had received. The winning guy turned out to be a student of Robert's teacher, who also wondered why his student was so strong. The next guy in the arena was a guy who had recently just reached level 1 and had already challenged Carl. Carl entered the arena with complete confidence in his victory, but he was immediately thrown out of the arena by a powerful blow and slammed into the wall. After the beaten Carl stood up, he decided to ask for a doping test. The 3 most suspicious students were taken to be checked. After some time, teachers and students returned with a message that there was no doping. But the main character didn't worry about it, because he knew that the test wouldn't show anything, because the pills were from another world. Jack performed in the competitive arena this time. Jack's opponent was carried out of the arena with severe wounds. Norm, who was watching this, noted that he was very cruel. Jim thought the same thing, went up to the arena and told Jack that this was just a competition. Jack answered the claim simply. He said that in the ring, fists do not have eyes, and he received injuries because he was weak. Jim chose next, and he chose Jack as his opponent. Jack's blows and techniques are unmatched. They look like a spear. Even students with the 3rd level cannot block his attacks. In turn, Jim, although he did not have the same defense as Kane, but he has a lot of experience in battles, and his smooth technique is like a tall tree rooted on a mountain. Ultimately, Jack lost the fight, although Jim only used basic techniques. While Jack stood exhausted on all fours, Jim approached him and said that he did not deserve to be his opponent. Glenn deserved to be him. But Jack didn't finish his sentence at Glenn and continued talking, turning to Norman, that Norm was also worthy. After Jim, Norm chose the opponent. Norman chose a random person who didn't buy his pills. His opponent, Chris, who was Robert's student, entered the arena and attacked first, using the fist crossbow technique. But the main character attacked back with the same technique, showing the difference between their attacks. When asked why his technique was stronger, Norm replied that he had the wrong stance to begin with. The guy accepted the criticism with his head held high and asked the main character to teach him more. Immediately after this, Norm attacked, saying that then let his blow be a motivation for excellence. The guy lost. He admitted that Norman's strength is much higher and that he is confident in his defeat. Already at the hotel, teacher Robert scolded Chris for showing gratitude to Norm, thereby humiliating their Kung school. Chris said that Norman really gave him important advice, which made the teacher even more angry, and the teacher slapped Chris. Robert turned his attention to 2 students who were taking berserker pills, hinting that their power was suspicious. He began to angrily forgive them by telling them about what they were using. In order to put on what he needed, he even forced them to undress, but it was worth it, and he found the berserker pills. Our main character sent the android to sell pills, and he himself began to train. He was focused and clearly practiced punches on the boxing bag, but the android returned discharged, although only half an hour had passed. Norm put the android on charge. Realizing that he was charging the android, he suspected something was wrong. To find the answer, Norman decided to look at his last memories before hibernation. The video showed that the android was attacked by a masked man. After defeating the robot, this man took the pills with him. Norman, realizing that none of his students could defeat his android, came to the conclusion that it was a teacher from one of the schools. On the 3rd day of the competition, the main character sat in the stadium and tried to understand who robbed the android, but throwing away his thoughts, he decided to focus on the fight. Alex fought in the arena, having taken a pill, the effect of which soon ended. Suddenly, he fell to his knees due to stomach pain. Unable to bear the pain, he released the substance that was interfering with him directly at Robert's teacher. The teacher standing in the liquid said that he would deal with Alex later. Despite the teacher's words, Alex could no longer stop and released a second stream. Norm, watching everything that was happening, thought about what bad luck the students of Kong School had, because they came across a pill with a constipation effect. But thanks to this, he found a possible robber. Already at the hotel, Norman talked with the android, whom he instructed to scan Robert about the results of the scan, which confirmed the teacher's guilt. At sunset, Robert, for some unknown reason, was tracking Ethan's teacher, and when he appeared, he joined him in his run. Suddenly, Robert began pestering Ethan, talking about his muscles and groping him at the same time. Teacher Ethan, flushed with anger, jumped away from Robert and towards the nearest tree, screaming. After Ethan ran away, Robert came around the corner. It turned out that this was our main character who used camouflage techniques to carry out his plan. Ethan himself was already in the room, getting ready to take a bath, talking about what had happened. When the teacher began to wash himself, an android in the guise of Robert entered the room. Ethan came out of the bathroom and discovered that his things were missing. When he went into the bedroom, he found Robert running away with his clothes. Ethan immediately went after Robert. Next, our attention shifts to the real Robert, who came to the place where Norm was selling pills. Then teacher Ethan suddenly ran up to him and put his underpants on his head. But then the real Ethan attacked Robert, shouting that he was a pervert. After this blow, there was a powerful explosion. Norm, who had already taken on his real form, was watching this and was filming what was happening on his phone. The next morning, a beaten-up Robert went outside and saw a crowd gathered in front of the stand. When Robert came closer, his face changed. He was very scared and angry at the same time. On the stand were photos of Robert with underpants on his head, as well as angry love messages to teacher Ethan. Then Ethan himself grabbed him by the shoulder. Robert asked to let him explain everything. But Robert was not allowed to explain anything, and so he decided to leave, disgraced. When Robert was walking through the forest, the android Norma attacked him from behind. Norman decided to rob Robert in return. He didn't find much money in the suitcase, but he did find some very useful pills. Having found a book with the technique of heavenly palm push-ups, pills, and money, he decided to return to the arena. Jim entered the arena and challenged Norman to a duel. Norman, like the crowd, was extremely surprised by this turn of events. Jim explained this by saying that he would soon move to the 4th level, and therefore he needed a worthy opponent. Norman agreed to the fight, also wanting to see what Jim was capable of. The fight began with a fist crossbow technique so powerful that the aura of this attack managed to repel even the spectators. The next technique was the Great Chain Chariot, but they also were unable to inflict significant damage on each other. After a flurry of punches, Norman saw an opportunity for a low sweep. But Jim managed to counterattack Norman, but Norm also blocked the attack. Norman, realizing that they were both very strong, suggested using one of the most powerful techniques instead of a long fuss. Jim accepted Norm's offer and got into a tiger stance and walked towards Norm using the wind step flow technique. Jim, talking about the fact that he can study 3 different techniques and that this is called being both strong and weak, rushed to the attack. Norman also did not stand still and rushed back using the Bloodhawk technique. After these attacks, Norman emerged victorious. All the students watching the fight cheered and praised Norman. Teacher Ben told Jim's teacher that it was not surprising that he lost, because Jim's attacks were not well thought out, and Norm's technique was truly unique. The main character himself, coming down from the arena, was thinking about whether the opponents in the college entrance exams would be the same, and about how strong Glenn would be then. But the main character joyfully raised his head and thought that he must follow this fascinating path to the end. On the 5th day of the competition, Jim came up to thank Norman, because after their fight he was able to rise to the next level. After this conversation, Jim went up to the stage, where Glenn was already waiting for him. During the battle, Jim relied on his peerless skills, and Glenn allowed Jim to attack, but he did not take damage. After an hour of their battle, Glenn, who was at a lower level, but was still able to win thanks to the palm of steadfastness, won. After some time, our main character examined the techniques received in exchange for pills. He was glad for them, because if he achieves perfection and ascends to the 6th level, he will become invincible in competitions. But he quickly realized that he would not have time to do this in the remaining 10 days, and therefore began to choose the one most suitable technique. He chose the Heavenly Palm Push-Up, which, although difficult to perform when perfected, produces 10 times the strength of the performer. On the 6th day of the competition, Charlie approached him and said that Glenn had reached level 4, which upset Norman. And then Norman school student guy Max entered the arena. Max said that although he doesn't really want to admit defeat right away, since he is his opponent, he thinks it will be better this way. But Norman was not happy with this, because fighting opponents who are weaker than him, he will be able to practice his push-up technique. And so that the enemy would remain, he said that he would fight only in a prone position. The crowd did not appreciate this move, but still thought about it, because this is how they can defeat Norm. Max accepted the proposals, regretting that he had not taken the pill, but he still thought that he could defeat the Norm in this position for now. Norm began doing push-ups, as if to show his disrespect for his opponent, so Max immediately attacked him. The crowd looked at the arena, wondering what was happening. Having done 6 push-ups, Norman could not stand it and attacked the enemy. After 6 push-ups, the blow did not exceed 30% of Norm's strength. One of the students discovered that if you eat 2 pills in a row, you will not get an enhanced effect, but will double the duration, which greatly increases the time of contractions. Since this effect was discovered, the demand for the pill has increased. As the competition continued, the points gradually went to the more capable students, forming 3 groups, the first being Glenn, who won with 1 palm. Also in the first was Jim, who even after losing to Norm and Glenn was quickly able to catch up with them. And the last member of the group was Norm, who fought in a prone position and was glad that he was not being challenged by Jim and Glenn. In the second group were Jack and Kane. Kane was one of those who did not buy the pills and fought on his own. Jack, although he initially seemed strong after losing to Jim, he began taking pills just like everyone else. In the last group, the difference between the forces was small, but in relation to the first 2 groups, it was the other way around. Norman continued to fight in a prone position. It was so hard for him that he even took pills at first, but he later adjusted. Since it became easier for him, he began to experiment, doing more than 10 push-ups, hitting from different positions. On the 14th day, he fought the last enemy before Glenn. Thanks to the last battle, he realized that he had reached the initial level. In the evening in the forest, lying surrounded by impact marks, he wondered why the system did not react to the equipment. Gathering his strength, he decided to try to repeat the technique one last time. And this attempt was crowned with success. Norm happily landed after receiving a notification from the system that the equipment had been detected. Norman decided to improve the technique, but before that, he decided to make sure that it did not consume chi energy. Having received an affirmative answer, he decided to find out the cost of the improvement. The protagonist's face reflected all the shock at the price received, because the cost for leveling up to full level was $830,000. Fortunately for Norman, he earned enough money from selling pills, so he collected his thoughts and raised the level of technology to full. To test the improvement, Norman assumed a prone position and noticed that his speed, even in this position, was the same as when he was standing. Immediately after this, he decided to test the strength of the blow by jumping up and heading towards the ground. He hit it and left the largest hole he had ever left. After the attack, Norman stood up enthusiastically and said that this was an incredible feeling and that he went to look for Kane to test his skills. Kane stood on the shore with Jack. Kane tried to convey to Jack that even if he was chosen by the assassin system, he does not have to kill everything and everyone, because he can also use it for the benefit of other people. Jack, having prepared a blow, talked Kane into thinking that they could really become friends. When suddenly Jack asked what if he killed a man, which shocked Kane. But the possible battle was prevented by Norman, who came for Kane. Norm ran to him, saying that he had been looking for him for a long time, because he did not expect Kane to go out for a night walk. Jack, knowing that he definitely couldn't defeat Norma, turned around and left, telling Kane to find him when he was free. Norman began to question Kane about what happened, but Kane said that he could not say and left, finally telling Norm to be wary of Jack. The last day of the competition arrived. Norman and Glenn stood in the arena. The spectators, in anticipation of the upcoming battle, discussed who would win. The teachers also stood and waited for the start. Glenn told Norm that if the main character fought him in the same stance as the others, he would lose. With the words that Norm was strong in this particular stance, Norman took a lying position. Saying that Norma would never be defeated, Glenn took a stance. Glenn and Jim's teachers, who were watching, said that Glenn was incredibly calm, which is rare, and that the Smith family had an extraordinary student. The battle began. Glenn quickly ran at Norm to hit him with his palm. Thinking to himself that Glenn's technique was lightning fast and silent, Norm jumped back. Norman realized that he needed to hurry up and began doing push-ups. Glenn continued to press on Norm, but Norman, even in a prone position, dodged his attacks. Glenn began to make an attack that the main character could not dodge. Therefore, Norman decided to meet this attack with his 8th melee-style technique. Norm, realizing that Glenn was no match for his opponent's past, decided to run away and fight as little as possible. But even so, Glenn did not lag behind Norman and tried to attack him. Norman pushed Glenn away by attacking with his foot while doing 9 push-ups. And in order to do push-ups for the last time, the main character used a bloody hawk strike to jump away. This helped, and Norman did his 10 push-ups. And immediately after this, shouting that he did not believe that the main character was strong in this particular position, and then let him try his blow, he attacked Glenn. Glenn realized at first glance that the blow was very powerful, as if the whole sky was falling on you. Even so, Gurren decided to block this attack by using the final Heaven's Crash Unshakable Palm technique. However, even such a powerful technique could not block such a strong blow, and Glenn lost. All the spectators were surprised. Not only did Glenn lose, but Norm also won while in such a stance. After defeating Glenn, Yang's school was announced as the winners, and a banquet was held afterwards. Norman realized that being a champion was not so good, because as soon as he returned from the toilet, he was immediately surrounded by fans. After this, we are transported to the banquet table, where Kane, constantly thinking about whether Jack killed a man or not, lied to Charlie that everything was fine. At the same time, Glenn and Jim said that next time they would definitely win, and Norman only jokingly asked why they were drunk if they were drinking cola. And having finished this dialogue, the 3 strongest participants clinked their glasses, signaling the end of the competition. On the roof of the hotel, there were teachers who also gathered together in honor of the end of the competition. Teacher Justin stood with a glass and thanked everyone for their congratulations. Jim's teacher said that he introduced such a talent as Norman, and Glenn's teacher said that if it had been 20 years ago, he would have been dissatisfied. But now they can control the gates of the kingdom. Teacher Justin told Ben not to talk nonsense while drunk, to which Teacher Jim told him that there was no point in hiding it anymore and their plans were to tell about it. The teachers began their story that 50 years ago, the Ichi energy returned to their world and then martial arts arose. But few people know that 20 years ago a blood moon appeared, as well as a gate that no one knew then where it led. While people were hesitating to enter or not, unknown creatures came out of the portal. Even the highest masters could not cope with them, because the portals opened in different places at the same time. With the return of Ki, the speed of training increased, which improved the situation. They were even able to counterattack on the other side of the portal. As a result, the portal was nicknamed the Gate of the Kingdom, as a door connecting different worlds. Once they were stabilized, they remained on Earth. Since each side can now come and go at will, the gates were closed, and information about them was hidden. At first, the information was available only to the state, the intelligence service, and some teachers. But it became more difficult to hide the information, and there were not enough teachers. so they decided to tell the students. After the story, one of the teachers, looking very frightened, asked if the color of the moon was red. And after receiving the answer, he said to look behind him. And when everyone turned around, they were frightened to discover that the moon was red. Old Man Ralph immediately appeared and said that the students had most likely already seen her. And although he planned to tell everything after the exams, he would have to rush things. After that, Ralph used a celestial sensor, which allows him to reconnoiter the situation on the other side of the portal. When Ralph finished reconnaissance, he said that the master of that world was about the 6th level, that the atmosphere allowed people to live there, and also that this world was an excellent opportunity to let students get acquainted with the gates. But the teachers said that this was not a good idea, because all the teachers had at least the 9th level, and they would be able to come in with the students. To which the old man replied that the world was just blossoming, and the most powerful creature of that world had only reached the 3rd level, and also instructed to gather students so that within 30 minutes they would decide to go or not. 15 minutes later, the students were told everything. The students took it with enthusiasm and interest. The teacher said that whether to go or not is everyone's choice, and gave me 15 minutes to think about everything. While everyone was discussing whether to go or not, Glenn, Jim, and Norm calmly went about their business. Jack thought this was a great opportunity to earn more points for killing. Kane thought that Jack would want to kill the people he was going with, so he decided to go too. 15 minutes later, the teacher gathered everyone again to ask who was coming. Glenn and Jim were the first to volunteer. Norman also gave his consent. Jack also agreed so as not to miss out on the opportunity to earn points. Kane also agreed because Jack went. They also called 2 more people, namely Leon and Claire. The teacher asked if it was dangerous for them with their skills to go there, to which Leon said that he was close to the 3rd level, and Claire said that she had berserker pills and would run away if anything happened. After the teacher was told that jade does not shine unless it is polished, he gave his permission. The director was already waiting for everyone near the portal. The teacher brought the students and said that among the 7 students, Norman became the leader. The director, before their departure, explained to them 3 main missions. The first is to record information about another world, to help develop the civilization of that world. At the second point, Norman's eyes lit up because if they influence the development of the world, they will be given a cash prize. The principal told the students about the butterfly effect, saying that the flapping of a butterfly's wing could cause a typhoon somewhere and saying that the students might be able to change that world. Also, the director, seeing the wounded Glenn, gave everyone a recovery pill. And then the director said that the period of stay in that world would last 4 months, to the dissatisfaction of Claire and Leon. He said that time in the worlds does not flow like theirs. After hearing this information, Claire and Leon calmed down. Claire decided to ask if it might be worth taking food, personal items, and clothes, and a bunch of other things with her. Hearing this, the director told them to use natural resources. The director said that when they entered the gate, it would be closed for 4 months or otherwise for 10 earthly days. So he asked everyone to call their relatives and say that they would have more training. When everyone left to call their relatives, Norman was upset because he had no one to call. But then Nola called him. She asked about when the main character would return, to which he decided to jokingly ask that she was already bored. However, Nola began screaming into the phone that Norman had left the company to her, was not calling, and was also withholding her salary. Norma told Nola that he would return in 10 days because he had business, and then asked him to tell the school director that he took first place, so that he would give more money and say that he would share it with her. Nola said that she knew he would win, and then asked how many pills he sold, since they agreed to split the profit in half. After which Norman pretended that he didn't hear anything, that he had lost the signal and hung up. Everyone talked and gathered in front of the gate. The teachers gave the last instructions that if there is an enemy, then attack without hesitation, and that there is no one stronger than them, but not to let down their vigilance. And the last thing the director told them was to return alive. Everything happened as they were told. When they entered, the gate disappeared. At first glance, there was nothing special about the world they found themselves in. Norman found the grass. It was a little different from ours, but the most important thing is that this grass can be converted into $13. Norman started collecting grass very quickly, which looked strange, so Kane wanted to ask what Norma was doing, but Glenn stopped him. Glenn assumed that Norm trained like this, but Norman himself only had money on his mind. Glenn said that he already wants to see Norm's new technique. Kane was also delighted, and Leon said that a genius remains a genius no matter what. Suddenly, Kane felt that his body suddenly became lighter. Jack felt it too. But immediately after that, the system began to say that he was a weakling, that he was a loser, that he couldn't even defeat a person without a system. The voice gave Jack a headache and he fell to the ground, screaming for the voice to get out of his head. When Kane approached him to check if everything was okay with him, Jack suddenly told him to take his hands off him and leave without saying anything. Claire was scared because his eyes were so cold that she couldn't even move a finger. Kane ran after Jack, saying that they do not know this world and it's better for them to stick together. Norm was thinking about why Kane ran after him, what kind of relationship they had. But before he could think about another thought in his head, Glenn asked about whether to follow them or not. But they didn't have time to think about this either, because they heard a suspicious sound. Suddenly they were surrounded by strange green creatures. Norman immediately gave out instructions. He told Jack to watch Leon, and Glenn to watch Claire, and Norman himself would clear the way for retreat. The green men rushed at them with strange clubs, and only the main character wanted to attack them, when suddenly all the little men began to eat their clubs, thereby showing that they were peaceful. As it turned out, these were not clubs but meat, but Leon said that even if he was dying of hunger, he would never eat it. But after some time, when everyone calmed down, he began to eat it. When he finished it, he said his body felt stronger. When they all ate it, they found out that the effect was different from the pills, but they still couldn't eat it because the taste was terrible. But even despite the bad taste, Norma ate this terrible thing in huge quantities, which caused bewilderment in everyone. But in fact, Norm ate it, not because it was delicious, but because they paid $138 for the meat. Suddenly, one of the little men approached the fire lit by our heroes and stuck his hands into it, as a result of which he burned and caused our heroes to laugh. Norm decided to teach a man how to make a fire. The little man was very happy when he saw the result. After training, he saw a little man who differed from others in skin color. When the main character approached, he saw that this boy could draw. But then suddenly the boy said in human language that he had just drawn this. After hearing this, Norman screamed in surprise to the whole forest that everyone came running and, just like Norm, were surprised. During the time they were in this world, they recorded their observations about it. They called the first goblin-like creatures GA, and found out that the creatures of this world are primitive. Claire is good at drawing, so she painted them on canvas, and Leon wrote down the characteristics of these creatures. After spending a week in this world, the heroes decided to split up to speed up the study of this world. If it weren't for the system, the main character would have left too, because eating such food every day was disgusting for him, but the system paid him for it. When Norm converted the food, the goblins reacted very strangely. But the hero didn't care. The main thing for him was that he could convert a lot of this world into money. For the hero, it was like a game where you explore rooms and collect resources. The hero really liked this world, because here he received much more than for pills. The only problem was that for one type of item he could get no more than $138,000. On top of that, the goblins, seeing things disappearing, began to think of Norman as a god, and the little goblin actually called Norm Dad. A month later, the little goblin invented his own type of writing. He said that the scripture for the gods that the main character uses was not good for him, so he decided to create a new one, and then asked Norm if his work was not good enough. Norman said that the boy had chosen the right path and to continue in the same spirit. But in fact, he already began to believe that it was not he who was God, but this child. Suddenly the earth began to tremble as if during an earthquake. A goblin came running to them, saying something in his own language. The main character asked to translate the child, what he said. In human language, this meant that wolves were approaching, which surprised the main character. In this world, there are creatures close to wolves from the earth. The main character called them alpha wolves. Before the start of winter, they gather in groups and go in search of food. Although the creatures of this world are not capable of learning martial arts, they can increase their physical strength through food. And although the leader of the pack is strong, the main problem is the number of wolves. The hero forced the Gie to retreat. They left full of all the provisions to slow down the wolves. After escaping, all the goblins were very upset. The child asked the protagonist why he didn't use his divine ability to make them disappear. The protagonist replied that they were created by heaven for a specific purpose, so he cannot destroy them. Then the goblins spoke in their own language, addressing Norm, and Norman asked the child to translate. They said their homes had been destroyed. Wolves were roaming around and they didn't have enough food to survive. The hero asked the little goblin to tell them not to worry because there would be wheat and food for everyone, and also said that they needed to hurry. Next, we see a wolf who ate ordinary meat. But then his stomach cramps and he uncontrollably throws up all the food he has eaten. Following him, the same thing happens to all the other wolves. In the morning, the main character with his nose closed and the goblins went out into the street, where the goblins saw something that amazed them, but made them happy. The child reacted violently to what Norman did, but the main character said to hold off on it and have lunch. Seeing that the goblins were kicking the wolves, Norm asked the child to tell them to stop and quickly butcher them, because they were just sleeping, and also said that they needed to find another place to live. Then we are transported to Glenn, who stands surrounded by other creatures who thank him for saving him. As it turned out, he saved them from Jack, who has become monstrously strong and kills everyone indiscriminately. He sent the creatures south to Norm. Next, we see Norm, who sits on a throne in a castle, wearing clothes similar to a shaman's, and asks the child, whom he already calls son, about the news. The child himself, shriveled from unfamiliarity, stood in clothes that were made for him by the Norm. He reported that the Ji, Li, Lud, and Li tribes, the Lin tribe, and the 4 northern tribes had been captured. After these words, the main character thought about who did this, what happened to the world, and about Cain, hoping that he was okay. Norman didn't take his pillmaster because there was nowhere to charge it, but he still had 10 pills of each type left. After the incident with the wolves, Norm helped find a new area to live in. He commissioned Adam, the name he gave the child, to build a castle and gave him the plans. Norman managed to make friends with the Alpha, so he did not attack their tribe. On Norm's side, there is a gifted child. The gay tribe is able to build anything, wolves that protect from enemy attacks, so he created a state and is the head of it. He decided to call the state the Nation of Countless Souls. All the tribes mentioned earlier appeared in the Great Book of the World of the Nation of Countless Souls, which contains information about this world. The main character doesn't know everything yet, but Adam is learning quickly, so he can help. 2 months later, we see Norman training on an invented obstacle course. To pass it, he used the Wind Pursuit technique, the 5 Beast technique, and the Iron Curtain. After completing it, the main character says that his Iron Curtain and 5 Beast techniques have reached the initial level, but the technique of chasing the wind has not yet. After training, he asked the system how much money he had, looked at the pill they were given, but decided not to use it until he brought all 3 techniques to the initial level. Then a boy came and said that the Lin tribe was approaching the palace. From the walls of the castle, Norman saw several dozen creatures from the Lin tribe. The goblin told them that his name was Adam, and that they were in the territory of the Nation of Countless Souls, and added that they should stop immediately. One of the creatures said that they were civilians, that they were attacked in the north by a demon king, and that an unknown hero told them to go east. The hero asked the child to tell him that there were no settlements further north, and that if they wanted to join them, they must live by their rules. Then we are transported to an unknown place where the massacre took place. Cain thanks Jim for his help because if it weren't for him, Jack would have killed him. But Jim didn't listen. He sat over the dead body of the animal, trying to reach him, hoping that he would wake up. Jim screamed at the top of his lungs for the animal to wake up. Jim abruptly approached Cain and, shouting, asked him if he had a resurrection pill, but Cain did not have it. Jim began to ask why Jack needed to kill everyone. Cain asked him to calm down, but Jim began to shout that when he left, everything was fine, and when he returned, he found everyone dead. Jim fell to his knees, saying that it was his fault that they brought horror into this world that destroyed this place. But then Cain slapped him in the face so that he would come to his senses. Cain began to say that there was no point in screaming and crying. Everyone was dead, that the most important thing was to prevent more deaths. Cain continued to talk. He said that Jack becomes stronger when he kills, that he is already stronger than all of them combined. And at the end, Cain began to say that they need to find Glenn and Norman, because with them they can enter into battle and kill Jack. 3 months later, there is a bad atmosphere in Norman's state, and famine may begin due to the creatures that came to them for help. Norman himself left for some time to train, taking his Alpha with him. Alpha and Norman began to run to the races. The main character, smiling maliciously, secured his victory by saying it out loud. The main character, having eaten the pill, asked the system how much it would cost to improve the techniques. Having received an answer, Norman only complained about the long notifications. Norman enthusiastically gave his permission. But after permission, nothing happened. After learning from the system, he found out that chi purification does not work in this world. But even so, Norm felt that he had become stronger. But without chi purification, the improvements only worked halfway. And so Norman returned home, where Adam was already happily greeting him. Adam shouted that everything was bad, explaining that while Norm was at training, a lot of people came to them, and now they had problems with food. Then a goblin speaking his own language ran up to Adam and Norm. Adam translated and said that a large crowd of people had gathered at the central gate, and they all wanted to enter it. Adam translated. The creatures who came asked to be let in and said that strong people were fighting the Demon King. Norman assumed that it was Adam's uncle, suggesting the guys and went to them, promising to return with victory. While Norm was running, Jack was already hitting Cain in his technique. Jack switched from Cain to Jim, elbowing him in the chin. Glenn decided not to stand aside and attacked Jack using an unshakable hand. Jack started asking them why there were 3 of them. Norman began to say that it was not Jack, which surprised Jim and Glenn. Jack said their skills were too weak to find out his identity. After finishing speaking, he immediately found himself behind Cain. Jack powerfully hit Cain in the back, thereby throwing him away. While the guys fought to the death, Norman calmly rode the Alpha, saying what could be better than meeting friends you haven't seen for 2 months. But then Cain flew into Norman from the sky, knocked back by Jack's blow. After the fall, Cain did not immediately notice that he had fallen on Norman. But as soon as he saw it, he immediately jumped up. Then Kane helped Norman get up, while saying that it became clear to him why the ground underneath was so soft. Norman said displeasedly that if not for the Iron Curtain technique, Kane would have killed him. Jim and Glenn were overjoyed when they saw Norman arrive. Jack noticed that Norm gave off an aura that he hated. Norman came asking why the guys were so tense if a master at the 6th training level could not appear in this world, and told everyone to stand back and watch. Norman had just gotten into a prone position to do push-ups when Jack attacked him. With his next blow, Jack kicked Norman's body, but the protagonist used the Iron Curtain to reduce the damage. After the blow, Norm could not understand how he had strength and agility greater than that of 6th level masters. The system notified Norm that his opponent was a master of the assassination system. Kane told Norman that it was Jack, which made Norm very surprised. Norman and Jack moved to attack, while Norm could not believe that Jack was a user of the system. After a clash of fists, Norm jumped back. Kane offered to team up, but Norman said that with their speed, what would they do? Norman whistled, and a pack of wolves immediately came running towards them. Norm told the guys to run away on the wolves while he fought Jack. Immediately after this phrase, Jack and the main character exchanged blows again. Kane wanted to return, said that if they teamed up, but Glenn interrupted him, saying that they did not have team battle skills and they only interfere with each other sometimes. Norman and Jack, surrounded by wolves, ran towards each other. Sometime later, already in Norman's country, Kane asked why Norm had not returned yet, to which Jim said that he had sent his eagle Brad on reconnaissance. The eagle flew back and reported that Norman was returning and that he had suffered. When Norman returned, Kane immediately began treating his wounds. Glenn said that none of them could defeat Jack. They could only unite, but they did not know how to work as a team. Kane said that he knew how Jack reached this level. He said that he just needed to kill someone to increase his strength. After these words, Norman began to suspect that Kane also had a system. After this, the system said that this was true, and that he was the master of the hero system, which gives points for good deeds. Norman asked why the system didn't tell her about this sooner, to which she said he didn't ask. Kane said that they must kill Jack as quickly as possible before he becomes even stronger. Norman said that he doesn't think so, because this world has limitations that Jack can't overcome. But at the same time, they have time to practice and learn to work as a team. Jim agreed and added that there was a month left before the gates opened, and Glenn said that they would be helped on the ground. Norm said that he shouldn't hope for it because Jack, like them, knows that there is a month before the opening. And as soon as he finished, Jack himself came to his country. Norman continued to say that all Jack would have to do was block the gate, because those above the 6th level would not pass, and those below would lose to him. At that moment, Jim's eagle flew in from reconnaissance. Jim said that Jack had already arrived, and Norman said that now they only have one chance, and that is to increase their strength and ability to work as a team. To take advantage of time, Norman led his people as far away from Jack as possible. It is not known for what reason, but many wild animals rush at Jack with the intention of killing. It wasn't known where Leon and Claire were, so Norman just hoped they didn't run into a demon. Norman asked Jim to send his eagle to investigate, and also added sleeping pills and diarrhea pills to Jack's food, but they did not work. Kane told Norman that there was a river beyond and they had nowhere else to go. Norman asked Jim about the distance between him and Jack, to which he said that he was about 10 miles away. While they were on the way, many fell ill, and many died from hunger and cold. Norman said that if they wanted to survive, they needed to make boats. To pump up Kane's system, Norman constantly gives him the opportunity to do good deeds. And Jim and Glenn, under pressure to survive, train every day. Suddenly, Norman smelled a bloody smell, and when he turned around, he saw a bright red flash. Jack did all this. He was already approaching them. Just as Jack wanted to attack the heroes, predators emerged from the water with the desire to kill him. 10 days later, the heroes and inhabitants of Norman's country stopped in tents on a hill. Our heroes were training. Norman fought 1 against 3. Jim jumped on Norm with the 5 beasts technique, but the protagonist blocked it with an 8-step uppercut. Norman said that Jim's fist is strong, but he still won't be able to stop him if he wants to escape. At this moment, Glenn used the unwavering palm technique, namely its pressing form. But Norm attacked Glenn, thereby blocking the technique. But after Glenn touched Norman, he felt his blood flow stop for a short time. This turned out to be Glenn's new ability. The main character said that it wasn't bad, and that although he couldn't use his legs, he could still use his arms, and used the Hawk's fist. But his blow was blocked by Kane with his reflection barrier technique. After all this, Norman admitted that he could not win against them alone. But the guys said that if Norm had done 1 push-up, the victory would have been in dispute, and that they would rely on his push-ups to fight Jack. Jim said that he received information from Brad. He said that Jack was 3 miles away from them, and Jim also asked if they would fight. Norman said that if they continued to run away, they would all die without Jack's help. Then Adam called Norman. Norm immediately went to him. Adam's fever has gotten worse, and although he has a wake-up pill, it doesn't help with his illness. After some time, the weather outside suddenly changed. Before the battle, Norman decided to ask the team if they had healing pills. Everyone said that they had already used them. Norman said he had one left, and he didn't know if Jack had one. Kane said that even before Norman they united against Jack, then he was not so strong, so they managed to wound him. Then he escaped and used the pill. Norman then took out the remaining berserker pills and distributed them. Having repeated the plan of action, the heroes folded their hands and shouted that they would succeed. Before the battle, Norman came to Adam and said that he had ordered everyone to leave, but Adam needed to stay because he might get even worse during the trip. On the way out, Norman took out his transformation master, which he took and did not use so as not to waste the charge. But today it could become their trump card. Since Jack reached the limit, the system began to destroy this world. The heroes came to Jack full of confidence and desire to win. Norman took a lying position, and Jim, Kane, and Glenn ran to detain Jack. Jack recognized that they were planning to distract him while Norman completed his technique. He doubted that it would cause him damage, but just in case, he decided to disrupt their plans. Glenn was the first to rush at Jack. Jack threw him away from him, but he still managed to use his technique, which paralyzes for a while. But it didn't work, and Jack quickly approached Glenn. Then Kane rushed to protect him, using a barrier of reflections. While Jack was distracted by Kane, Jim attacked from behind. But Jack didn't even turn around. He just used the barrier to push Jim away. Jack went to Norman, saying that for some unknown reason he felt an aura that he hated from him. Then Adam crawled out of the tent and asked not to touch his dad. Jack said he was annoying and kicked a rock at him using his strength. The stone flew straight into Adam's body, wounding him and throwing him off. Immediately after this blow, lightning struck Jack's feet. And Jack understood why, because Adam is the son of this world. Norman was about to call the android, but he was stopped by the shouts of the guys who told Norm not to stop, after which Jim attacked him, saying that his weak point was his forehead. But Jack, getting ready, stood up, saying that the one who jumps above his head is like a moth flying straight into the flame. But it turned out to be a trap. While Jim was distracting him, Glenn was already flying at his feet. Kane also flew from behind to his feet. They all wrapped their arms around Jack to prevent him from interfering with Norman. Before the battle, the guys came up with this tactic. The thing is that Jim's technique has 5 types of animals. Each of them is assigned a part of the body, and if he names one of them 3 times, then they focus only on that part. At this time, Norman had only completed his 6th push-up. Jim shouted at him to speed up. A moment later, Jack threw everyone off of him in different directions. After that, Jack walked up to Adam, took him by the neck, and pierced his chest. From his chest, he took out the core of this world. And on Norman's 9th push-up, Jack walked up and stomped him into the ground with his foot. But fortunately for everyone, it turned out to be an android, which was simply a distraction. And then an enraged Norman came out, shouting the name of the technique, namely the earthquake palm. Norman attacked Jack, who in turn was helped by the world itself. Jack did not dodge, but decided to block such a powerful blow. Jack continued to block, but still the blow went through, and Norman killed Jack. The system sent a notification that it had discovered a system that could be redesigned, to which Norm gave his permission. After which Norman fell to the ground, but Keen arrived in time and gave him a resurrection pill. The hero immediately went to look for his son. Jim handed Adam's body to Norman, and Norm in turn began asking about the pill. And when they told him that the last pill had been given to him, he screamed loudly. But then the core of this world flew out of Jack's body. The cannonball flew, and the heroes followed it. And when it fell to the ground, a golden tree appeared. A golden apple fell from a tree into the protagonist's hand. Where did little Adam hatch from? Norman immediately asked him if he was his son, but the new Adam asked him who you are. Norman, without hesitation, told him that he was his father. Kane said that the baby apparently inherited the knowledge of Adam's past, but at the same time lost his memories. Norman, remembering that Adam is a child of the world, understood everything. He understood why Adam was different from all his relatives. I understood why he was born a child prodigy and spoke his language, why he wrote down everything for him. I understood why Adam was perceived as a father and not as a god like others. Kane said that maybe the doctors from their world could restore his memory, but Norman said that it was enough for him that Adam was alive, and that his place in this world. Having finished this topic, Kale handed Norman his transformation master. Norman asked him that he really didn't even ask him what it was, but Kane replied that everyone has skeletons in their closet, including him. After that, Kane and Norman shook hands, and at the same moment, Jim and Glenn ran up to them to shake hands with everyone. And with the laughter that was a side effect of the berserker pills, our heroes ended their adventure in another world. Teachers stood in front of the portal, not understanding where the children were, because the portal opened half an hour ago. Immediately after leaving the portal, our heroes began to cleanse the key of heaven and earth. While the heroes were being cleansed, Claire and Leon emerged from the portal and got lost in the cave for 4 months. They began to show their bags with plants from that world, Leon said that they strengthened Ki, and Claire asked permission to take them. But the director said no, because everything that was found in another world is handed over for research. But a little later, they will receive a reward for them. The teachers and the director saw that the heroes' Ki had cleared and wanted to see their progress. Our main character has reached level 6. Glenn and Jim reached level 5. Kane only reached level 3. Claire and Leon were shocked when they heard that Norman had reached the second stage in one go. But suddenly the director noticed Jack was missing. The heroes suddenly froze with sad faces in front of the director. The director asked what happened there, suggesting that it was an accident. Kane said that as soon as they entered the other world, Jack became not himself, and in the end he left them no choice. Norman gave Mr. Ralph a book with all the information about that world. The director thought about it after the words about Jack. The director pretended that he believed it, and asked to tell more if there was anything. But the heroes replied that they had nothing to say. But then the director grabbed the heroes, telling the teachers that he would bring them to one place and return them. The students said that they killed Jack in self-defense, but the headmaster said that he was not going to punish them, and said that the place where they were flying was far away, and they could sleep. The heroes could not calm down, so he put them to sleep with his powers. The main character woke up in a completely white building alone with an unfamiliar man, not understanding where he was. The man, who was sitting with his back to the hero, said that it does not matter where the main character is now. All four were given strange stones. Kane's turned red. The man said that this means Kane has a system. Norman was also thrown a stone, but he, guessing that he might now be exposed, grabbed the strap. Having asked a question about the cost of the stone, and having heard that all the money in the world would not be enough, Norm said that this was not the most common necklace, but the man shouted and told him not to drag his feet and take the stone in his hand. The main character asked why there was such a rush, and recalled that the man promised to return him to Ralph and friends. The man said that he would return it, but only if the stone did not change color. And as soon as the hero took the stone in his hands, the stone began to burn bright red. We are transported to the director, who was talking with Ralph. Ralph said the state has known about the systems for a long time, so a league of outstanding talent was created to find owners. The old man said that they were in one of the branches of the league, and also said that the man who was checking them was a member of this league, and that only members of the league had instruments to identify a person with the system. The director told Kane that a decree had been approved, according to which all users of the systems were required to be in the league, and that from that moment on, he was prohibited from taking entrance exams. Kane asked if he could refuse, but the director said no, because the system is still poorly understood, that the system cannot be destroyed, so it is better to contain it, which is the task of the league. The student said that the system is nothing more than a tool, and everything depends on the person. He said that he will not cause trouble to the country and will not harm anyone. Ralph said that the league is also needed for the safety of users, because the system is suppressed only in their world. But when entering other worlds, the system may behave differently, an example of which is Jack, but he is not the first victim and not the last. The director said that he would still continue to improve his skills in the league. The hero asked if he could do good, and when he heard that he could, he agreed to join. After that, Kane decided to ask what was wrong with the guys, to which he replied that everything was fine with them. The system had not yet been discovered. Kane breathed a sigh of relief. But the director said that this is not a fact yet, because the system can move from one person to another person, who was nearby in their case to Norman. The principal returned to the rest of the students to see how things were going. When he heard the answer that everything was fine, he looked at Norm with some suspicion. The old man asked to see the results, and saw that Norman's amulet was burning very brightly. He asked how this was so, to which the man from the league said that this was a normal reaction to contact with the system. The reactions of the students were different. Norm, pretending to be surprised, confirmed his guess that Ralph knew about the system, and Jim and Glenn did not understand what they were talking about. A league employee said that if a person has a system, the stone changes color to red, but with Norman it just glowed. Already in the office, the employee from the league realized that the glow of the stone upon contact with Norman was more like contact with the divine exchange system. Suddenly, an unfamiliar office with a ringing telephone appears to our attention. This call was to a man with a dog tattoo. He agreed with everything that was said on the phone, where he was told about Norman and his loved ones. We are transported to the main characters, who are traveling with the director and with a female league employee, who said that she was forced to drop them off. But before that, the chance of spreading information must be prevented. The director decided to make sure that everything would be okay with the guys, and the woman rushed to say that their neuralizer was safe. She turned to the guys, holding a camera in her hand, and seemed to take a photograph of them. This device erased the guys' memory. The last thing they remembered was that they were flying, after which they immediately began to ask why there were 3 of them. The device had no effect on Norman. He was stunned that they could erase memory. but he remained calm for the sake of secrecy. The director pulled the guys out of the car, saying that their check was over. Norman decided to ask where Kane was, to which the old man said that for some reason he could not go with them. Our hero was already at the hotel at night, from where he will go home in the morning. The hero wandered from one side of the room to the other, thinking about everything that had happened to him that day. He decided to ask why she was not found. She said that it was connected to the owner's soul, so it could not be detected. Then Norm decided to ask about the fact that he still had a memory. The system said that the owner's soul is connected to it forever, and it is impossible to change the soul. After which Norm said that the system is as cool as he is, calling himself its dad, to which the system remained questioningly silent. And so our hero returned home after a long journey. Norm stood at the door, afraid of what would happen to him, because he had spent all the money, even though they agreed to divide it equally. But then the door began to open. As soon as the door opened, Norman began showering Nola with compliments, saying that she was an angel, that she was Miss Universe. But when he opened his eyes, he found a huge worm in front of him. Norman, asking what kind of garbage this was, got scared, to which the worm responded with fear. The worm crawled towards Nola in tears, who immediately began asking why he scared her. Norman hurried to ask Nola who this weirdo was. She said that the energy worm was Jimmy, which she bought from a merchant from another world. Nola said that his meat was as effective as small recovery pills, and eating meat in large quantities generally increases the amount of QE. To the hero's reaction, which involved buying 2 more of these and eating them, Nola said that she would not let him eat such a cutie. She said that Jimmy's slime had exactly the same effect, even though it looked gross. But as soon as Jimmy relaxed, he discovered that Nola and Jimmy were looking at him with a predatory look, discussing how delicious he looked. Norman, saying that the effect was cool, decided to find out if this was all the motivation. She began to talk about the Baker family, which trades in the field of martial arts, namely weapons and food. She said that she supplies them with mucus as a material, to which they add their own oats, resulting in something like oatmeal, which they sell. She added to her speech that she was simply supplying the material, leaving the paperwork to the Baker company, thus hiding Jimmy's existence. At first, the hero said with some disgust that people were paying for his worm's mucus, after which he added that this was ideal. But Nola immediately brought him down to earth, saying that all the money received goes to the benefit of the company. Norman was offended by this and began to say that he would not stoop so low and that he had no problems with finances, realizing that all his money is in cryptocurrency, and that if Nola asked to give him her half of the sales of the pill, he will not be able to return it to her. Only the main character wanted to leave, like Nola, stroking Jimmy. She said that Norman definitely has reasons why he cannot give her interest, so she will not torture him. Moreover, she asked if the main character was hungry and said that she would go cook. Next, we are transported to a martial arts association in northern Yan, where a man stands holding the League of Extraordinary Talent stone. Since nothing happened to the stone, they released it, after erasing its memory. At the exit, his colleague was already waiting for the man, who began to ask him about what was there, but the man only said that when he came in and sat down, he felt dizzy and was released. Next, we are transferred to the League's office, where they talk about how they have already checked 14 possible owners of the 18 systems, but have not found them. The man sitting at the table decided to make sure that the owner was definitely in northern Yan, to which another person replied that the probability of this was 70 or 80%. The man at the table said that in 2 days, there will be a banquet at which all the influential masters will be. So he ordered to check whether the people from the list will be there, and if they are not, then add them there. Next, we are transported to Norman's room, where Rena calls him on the phone. She called him to invite him to a banquet where there would be influential people with whom Rena would help establish contact, and she also added that attendance was required. Norman was standing ready for the banquet when suddenly he received a call. The caller turned out to be Director Ian, who told Norman that he had already collected $1 million to retain the second place they agreed on. However, the director said that for first place, he could request bonuses, but Norm refused, asking him to find him several exercises for the body. He listed so many techniques that the director did not have time to write down. When Norm finished speaking, he turned around and saw Nola, who was coming down the stairs and that evening was above all praise. She asked Norman what she looked like, to which he told her that she was very beautiful. Norman began praising the dress, which he said his mother had worn but was still timeless even after all these years. Norman allowed Nola not to return the dress and hurried her because the car was already waiting for them. Upon arrival, Rena was already waiting for them, dressed in a dress the color of space. Nola came up to Rena and said that she looked so beautiful today. Their sweet message was interrupted by a man who arrived at the banquet on a tractor. A tractor driver overturned other visitors' foreign cars as a joke. When he got out of the tractor, he was immediately surrounded by a disgruntled crowd. He started saying that if everyone drives a sports car and you drive a sports car, then that's stupid, but a tractor is a different style. But his Uncle Clint said that his actions reflected on the Link family. Rin, watching the guy, realized that this guy is the son of the Link family. Norman said that no matter what he was, as long as he didn't provoke him, he didn't care about him. People recognized him as the second son of the Lin family, namely Richard. Richard found himself a user of a system that rewarded him for his mischief. Richard began to look closely at Norman, trying to understand whether Nola and Rena were his close friends, and also noticed that the system was not visible at all. The banquet began, where Rin introduced Norman to celebrities, and although Norm did not like such events, he understood that it was necessary for the development of the company. In the middle of the evening, people burst into the banquet, one person working for the Wushu Association, and asked not to interfere with the investigation. He said they were instructed to act, and if there were any doubts, to bring them to him. While the two employees were talking, Norman noticed red armbands on their suits. And then it dawned on Norman that the people were not from the Martial Arts Association, but employees of the League of Outstanding Talents.